Chapter 1. The Girl Who Went for a Walk. There are disappearances that begin with a scream, a struggle, a witness running toward the police, a car found abandoned on the side of a highway. And then there are disappearances that begin with something so ordinary that nobody thinks twice about it. A young woman finishes work. She goes back to her room, changes her clothes, tells someone she's going for a walk, and leaves. That's it. No suitcase packed beside the door. Just a walk. And then somehow that ordinary afternoon becomes the last chapter of her life that anyone can prove. On December 1st, 1946, 18-year-old Paula Jean Welden was a sophomore at Bennington College in Vermont. She was young. She was intelligent. She came from Stamford, Connecticut. And from everything we know, she had no idea that she was about to become the center of one of Vermont's most enduring mysteries. Paula wasn't planning an expedition. She wasn't dressed like someone preparing to spend the night in the mountains. She didn't carry camping equipment. She didn't take extra clothes. She didn't appear to be preparing for some dangerous adventure. She simply wanted to go walking. The destination was the Long Trail. For anyone who has never seen Vermont in winter, it's difficult to understand how quickly a harmless afternoon outdoors can turn dangerous. The Green Mountains can be beautiful, but beautiful doesn't mean forgiving. The temperature drops, daylight disappears, trails become difficult to follow. And in 1946, there was no smartphone in your pocket, no GPS, no emergency location sharing, no simple way to call somebody when you realize you've taken the wrong turn. If you became lost, you were genuinely lost. And if nobody knew exactly where you were, finding you could become almost impossible. Paula's decision that afternoon probably felt completely different to her than it does to us today. To Paula, it may have been nothing more than a chance to get away from campus for a few hours. A little exercise, a little solitude, maybe just curiosity. She wanted to see the Long Trail, and that detail matters. Because when we look at a disappearance decades later, it's tempting to imagine that the person knew they were walking toward danger. Usually they didn't. People don't normally step into history knowing they're about to become a mystery. Paula was simply living her life. She had classes, friends, a roommate, a job in the college dining hall. She had a family back in Connecticut. She had 3 younger sisters. There were people who expected her to come back. And that Sunday afternoon, she didn't. The afternoon had already begun when Paula finished her work at the college dining hall. She returned to her room. At some point, she changed into clothing suitable for walking. Then she left the campus. The exact details of the journey would later become extremely important, because investigators would spend years trying to reconstruct the few hours between Paula leaving Bennington College and the moment she disappeared. Who picked her up? Where did she get out? Who saw her? How far did she actually walk? And most importantly, who was the last person to see her? At first, nobody knew any of those answers. In fact, when Paula didn't return that evening, there wasn't immediately a sense that something terrible had happened. Her roommate believed she might simply be somewhere else, maybe at the library, maybe visiting someone. Maybe she had decided to stay out longer. That assumption is understandable. When someone you know doesn't come back on time, your first thought usually isn't murder. It isn't kidnapping. It isn't disappearance. It's inconvenience. She's late. She'll be back, and then the hours pass. The next morning arrives, and Paula still isn't there. That is when ordinary concern begins turning into fear. The college was notified, and soon the first searches began. At that moment, investigators had a problem that would haunt the case from the beginning. They didn't know exactly where to search. They knew Paula had gone out walking. They knew she had talked about the Long Trail. But the wilderness doesn't give investigators a neat starting point. It gives them miles of possibilities: roads, trails, hills, streams, cabins, bridges, dense forest, and in December, snow and darkness. The first people searching for Paula were not working from some carefully preserved, modern missing person protocol. This was 1946. There were no modern search and rescue teams, no GPS coordinates, no cell phone records, no security cameras covering roads, no digital footprint showing where someone had been. Investigators had witnesses, newspaper reports, memories, and the landscape itself. That was about it. Then something happened that changed the search. A photograph of Paula appeared in the newspaper. Someone recognized her. A man named Ernie Whitman told people that he had spoken to a young woman matching Paula's description on the afternoon she disappeared. According to the historical accounts, he and several companions encountered her near Woodford. She asked about the Long Trail. She wanted to know how to get there. and she continued in that direction. That conversation became one of the most important pieces of the timeline, because now investigators had something they desperately needed, a confirmed or at least strongly supported location. Paula had been heading toward the trail. She hadn't simply vanished from the college campus. She had actually made it into the area. She was moving toward the wilderness, and somebody had seen her, but that still left an enormous question. What happened after that? Imagine standing there in December. The sun is dropping, the temperature is falling, and you're 18 years old, you're alone. You don't have proper overnight equipment. You don't have a flashlight that can guide you for miles. You don't have a phone, and you don't necessarily know exactly how long the trail will take. If Paula continued walking, she was moving deeper into an environment that was becoming more dangerous by the minute. The long trail itself is historic, but in 1946, the area was not the carefully mapped recreational environment that many hikers know today. There were fewer people, fewer facilities, and much less technology, so the search teams had a terrifying possibility to consider. Maybe Paula had become lost. Maybe she had fallen. Maybe she had become injured. Maybe she had simply underestimated how quickly darkness would arrive. That theory required no conspiracy, no murderer, no secret meeting, just one bad decision followed by terrible weather. But investigators couldn't stop there, because there were other possibilities. What if Paula had met someone? What if somebody offered her a ride? What if she left the trail? What if somebody had deliberately harmed her? And what if the reason nobody could find her wasn't because the searchers were looking in the wrong place, but because someone had made sure she wouldn't be found? Those questions would follow the case for decades. The search grew, students participated, faculty participated, local residents joined, volunteers went into the mountains. The search eventually involved hundreds of people, including members of the National Guard and others brought in to help. Contemporary records show that authorities were also seeking information through the FBI, and a substantial reward was offered for information leading to Paula's whereabouts. Think about that for a moment. Hundreds of people searching mountains, looking through woods, checking trails, following roads, examining possible locations. And still, nothing, no body, no clear personal belongings, no definitive trail leading away from the area, no final message, no explanation. The longer the search continued, the more frightening the situation became, because every day that passed made a simple rescue less likely. If Paula was injured somewhere in the wilderness, time was running against her. If she had become lost, she was losing strength. If she had been kidnapped, every passing hour made her harder to locate. And if she had died, then the question became even more difficult. Where was her body? One of the most haunting aspects of Paula Welden's story is that the investigation produced fragments, pieces, small observations, witness statements, possible sightings, but never the one thing everyone needed, a conclusion. A person can disappear and leave behind hundreds of clues, but if none of those clues connects, the mystery remains. And Paula's case would become exactly that, a collection of fragments, some reliable, some uncertain, some contradictory, and some that would become more dramatic with every retelling. This is where we have to be careful, because over the years, Paula's disappearance became attached to something called the Bennington Triangle. The name sounds ancient. It sounds as if it belongs to some legendary place where people disappear for mysterious reasons. But the term itself is much more modern. It wasn't something investigators in 1946 were talking about. It developed later, around a group of unexplained disappearances in the wider Bennington area. That distinction matters because the real story is already strange enough. It doesn't need ghosts, it doesn't need monsters, it doesn't need invented evidence. The truth is more unsettling. A young woman walked toward a trail. People saw her, then nobody ever saw her again. And despite an enormous search, she was never found. For Paula's family, this wasn't a mystery. It was their daughter, their sister, their child. Her father, William Welden, became involved in the search. Newspaper photographs from the time show him looking for his daughter. The family offered a reward. They waited, they hoped, and eventually hope had to coexist with the possibility that Paula was dead. That's something true crime stories can sometimes forget. The audience gets a mystery. The family gets a lifetime. Every birthday, every Christmas. Every phone call, every stranger who looks vaguely familiar. Every time somebody says they might have seen her. Every time a possible lead appears, guys, and disappears. That is the human cost of an unsolved disappearance. There is no ending. There is only uncertainty. And Paula's story was about to become even bigger than the disappearance itself. Because the investigation exposed serious weaknesses in the way Vermont handled major crimes and missing person cases. There were criticisms of the search, criticisms of coordination, criticisms of law enforcement, and eventually the disappearance of Paula Welden became one of the events associated with the creation of the Vermont State Police in 1947. So in an unexpected way, Paula's disappearance changed Vermont. Her family wanted one thing, to find their daughter. But her disappearance would become part of a much larger institutional story. A story about what happens when a rural state has to confront a mystery that local authorities are not prepared to handle. And that raises a question. If the investigation had been different, would Paula have been found? We'll never know, but that question is impossible to avoid. There is another reason this case has survived for so long. Paula's disappearance happened at a time when America itself was changing. World War II had ended only the year before. The country was entering a new era, but rural Vermont still had a very different rhythm. People knew their neighbors. Information traveled slowly. Newspapers were central to public communication, and the wilderness was still genuinely wild. Today, if a college student disappears, investigators can potentially examine phone data, digital records, surveillance cameras, financial transactions, social media, vehicle tracking, and countless other sources of evidence. In 1946, none of that existed. Investigators had to reconstruct a person's movements through human memory. And human memory is fragile. A witness might remember the wrong time, the wrong road, the wrong clothing, a face they saw for only a few seconds. And as the days turn into weeks, memory changes. That may be one of the most important clues in understanding why Paula's case became so difficult. The investigation didn't begin with a perfect timeline. It had to build one, and every missing piece created another possibility. By the time winter settled over Vermont, Paula was gone. The search continued, but the landscape was changing. Snow covered the ground, visibility became worse, and the wilderness that had once offered investigators clues was now burying them. Footprints disappear, tracks disappear, small objects become invisible. A person can vanish into a winter landscape without leaving anything obvious behind. The searchers were looking for a person, but the mountain was slowly erasing the evidence. And somewhere in that landscape, the answer may have already been waiting. Paula Welden left Bennington College on December 1st, 1946. She was 18 years old. She intended to walk. She was seen heading toward the long trail. And then, nothing. No confirmed return. No confirmed destination. No confirmed explanation, just silence. For her family, that silence lasted years, then decades, and eventually an entire lifetime. But the story doesn't end with the search, because investigators began looking at the people who had crossed paths with Paula, and one of those people would become one of the most controversial figures in the case. His name was Fred Gaudette, and what investigators learned about him would make the possibility of foul play much harder to dismiss. But it would also create another problem. Suspicion is not proof, and in a case where there is no body, no murder weapon, and no forensic evidence, the difference between the two becomes enormous. That is where our story goes next. Chapter 2. The Last Confirmed Sightings. The hardest part of a disappearance is usually not figuring out where someone was. It's figuring out where they were last, because once that final confirmed moment is established, investigators can work backward. They can ask who was there, which roads were nearby, who could have approached the person, what direction they were traveling, and how much time existed between that moment and the disappearance. With Paula Welden, that final window was frighteningly small. On December 1st, 1946, Paula left Bennington College sometime around 2:30 in the afternoon. The FBI's contemporary bulletin later recorded that she left campus to go hiking and was last seen on the lower portion of the long trail at approximately 4:15 p.m., less than 2 hours. That's all investigators had to reconstruct, and the first part of that reconstruction was surprisingly ordinary. Paula walked away from campus. She eventually began hitchhiking. A motorist picked her up and drove her toward Route 9. She was heading toward the long trail, and she apparently told the driver exactly where she wanted to go. That matters, because it suggests this wasn't some completely spontaneous decision. Paula had a destination in mind. She wanted to see the trail. She wanted to hike, but there was one problem. She was not prepared for what the afternoon was about to become. The weather wasn't necessarily terrifying when Paula left. That may be one reason nobody stopped her. She wasn't walking into a blizzard at 2:30 in the afternoon. The day was still young, there was still daylight. And from Paula's perspective, she probably had plenty of time. But winter in Vermont doesn't wait for you. The sun disappears early, temperatures can fall quickly, and a trail that looks manageable during daylight can become something completely different after dark. Paula was wearing a red parka with a hood, blue jeans, and heavy sneakers. The FBI description recorded her height as 5 feet 5 inches, and her weight as 122 pounds. She was also wearing a small gold Elgin wristwatch. She didn't appear to be carrying the kind of equipment you would expect from someone planning to spend a night in the mountains. No sleeping bag, no backpack filled with food, no obvious emergency supplies, nothing that suggested she expected to disappear into the wilderness for days. She was going for a walk, and she expected to come back. That simple assumption would become one of the most important facts in the entire case. At some point during her journey, Paula encountered people who were coming out of the area she was entering. This is where the story becomes especially interesting, because Paula wasn't alone on the trail. Other hikers were there, people saw her. People spoke with her, she asked questions, and then she continued walking. According to historical accounts, one of the people she encountered was Ernie Whitman, who was returning from the area with companions. Paula asked about the long trail, apparently wanting to know more about its length and direction. Think about that conversation. It may have lasted only a minute, maybe less. A stranger sees a young woman. She asks a simple question. He answers, she thanks him. Then she walks away. Neither person knows that the conversation is about to become part of a decades-long investigation. Whitman didn't know Paula was missing. He didn't know her name. He didn't know that people would later ask him to remember exactly what she looked like, exactly what she said, exactly which direction she walked. He was simply another person Paula encountered that afternoon, until the newspaper photograph appeared. That's one of the strange things about missing person cases. The people who hold the most important information often don't realize they have it. A person sees something completely ordinary. A car passing, someone walking. A conversation, a person standing outside a building. Nothing about it feels important. Then 2 days later, investigators ask, "Did you see her?" Suddenly, that ordinary moment becomes something you desperately wish you could remember perfectly. What color was her coat? Was she carrying anything? Did she look frightened? Was she alone? Was she walking quickly? Did she seem tired? Did she mention where she was going? Was there somebody behind her? Human memory doesn't work like a video recording. It changes, it fills gaps. It mixes moments together. And in 1946, investigators had almost nothing else. No camera footage, no location history, no electronic records. Just people remembering what they had seen. But there was something about Paula that witnesses could remember. The red coat, it stood out. That red parka would become one of the defining details of the case. Imagine seeing a lone figure in winter clothing against the Vermont landscape. A bright red coat, a young woman. Walking toward the mountains, it would be easy to remember. And yet, after that afternoon, the red coat disappeared too. No coat was found, no body was found, no abandoned backpack, no clear trail of belongings. Nothing that investigators could point to and say, this is where Paula stopped. That absence would become increasingly disturbing, because if she had simply become lost, where was she? If she had fallen, where was the body? If she had been injured, why had nobody discovered her? And if someone had taken her, how had they managed to do it without leaving an obvious trace? There's another detail that makes the timing so important. Paula's last known movements occurred late in the afternoon. The light was fading, the temperature was dropping, and the further she traveled, the fewer people were around. The environment was slowly becoming quieter. And that is exactly the kind of situation in which a disappearance can happen without witnesses. A person can be visible at one moment and completely alone minutes later. That's the terrifying transition in Paula's story. She wasn't missing when she began the walk. She wasn't missing when she hitchhiked. She wasn't missing when she spoke with other people. She wasn't missing when she entered the trail area. She was visible, she was moving. People knew where she was going. And then there was no more certainty. Some later accounts describe additional possible sightings farther along the trail, but not all of these reports have the same level of reliability. That's important. In a mystery that has lasted decades, every alleged sighting can become part of the legend. Someone remembers seeing a woman. Someone remembers a red coat. Someone hears that Paula might have gone farther up the trail. Another person thinks they saw her somewhere else. And suddenly the disappearance appears to have a dozen possible timelines. But investigators have to separate confirmed evidence from possible evidence. And that is where the case becomes frustrating. The strongest historical record places Paula on the long trail that afternoon. After that, the certainty falls apart. Her roommate was expecting her back. Paula didn't return that evening. But initially, nobody knew that this was a disappearance. That distinction matters. If someone tells you they're going hiking and doesn't come back at the exact time you expected, you might assume they're staying somewhere else. Maybe they found a friend. Maybe they went to the library. Maybe they changed their plans. Maybe they're simply late. Paula's roommate reportedly didn't immediately assume the worst. It was only after Paula failed to return and then failed to appear as expected that concern escalated. The college became involved. Her family was contacted, and then the question changed. Not, where is Paula? But, where was Paula last seen? That question sent investigators back through the previous afternoon. And that's when the witnesses became crucial. The searchers now had a rough route. Campus. The road. The ride Route 9. The long trail. The mountains. It sounded like a path. Almost like a line investigators could simply follow. But the wilderness doesn't work that way. A person can leave a trail, take a side path, walk in the wrong direction, cross a stream, climb over a ridge, follow a road, accept a ride, or simply become disoriented. Every branch creates another possibility. And investigators were trying to locate one 18-year-old woman in a landscape that offered thousands of places to disappear. Then the search began in earnest. Students went looking, faculty went looking, local residents went looking. Paula's father arrived and became involved in the effort to find his daughter. The search expanded far beyond the immediate trail. Ground teams worked through the area. People examined roads. Searchers looked at trails and possible routes. Aircraft were eventually used. The scale grew. And still, nothing. The contemporary FBI bulletin shows just how serious the search had become by early 1947. Authorities were distributing a detailed physical description of Paula and asking law enforcement personnel for information. This was no longer a missing college student case being handled quietly. Paula's disappearance had become a statewide mystery, and with every unsuccessful search, the theories became darker. At first, getting lost seemed like the obvious possibility. It was December. She was inexperienced with the area. She wasn't equipped for a night in the mountains. Maybe she had wandered off the trail. Maybe she had fallen somewhere searchers couldn't see. Maybe snow had covered the evidence. Maybe the cold had taken her life. There was nothing impossible about that explanation. In fact, it may have been the simplest one. But simplicity isn't the same thing as certainty. Because if Paula had died in the wilderness, why couldn't anyone find her? Searchers weren't casually looking around for an afternoon. They searched repeatedly. They expanded the area. They examined the trail. They searched surrounding terrain. And still no body. No clothing, no watch. No personal belongings, no unmistakable evidence. The mountain seemed to have swallowed her whole. And then investigators started looking at another possibility. What if Paula never made it very far into the woods? What if something happened near the trail? What if someone encountered her? What if she accepted another ride? What if the final person who saw her wasn't a harmless stranger? Those questions brought investigators back to the people living and working near the route. And among them was a man who would become one of the most controversial figures in the entire investigation. His name was Fred Gaudet, and unlike a mysterious stranger who appeared only in a rumor, Gaudet had a documented connection to the area. He lived near Harbor Road, he was a lumberman, and investigators later considered him a person of interest. But what made him suspicious wasn't simply that he was nearby. It was his behavior, his statements, and the inconsistencies that investigators believed they found in his account of that evening. According to later accounts of the investigation, Gaudet gave conflicting explanations about his movements and admitted lying to police. That doesn't prove he harmed Paula. It doesn't even prove that he encountered her. But in an unsolved disappearance, a person who lies to investigators naturally attracts attention. And suddenly the case had something it hadn't had before. A possible suspect, a possible explanation, and a question that would remain unanswered for decades. Did investigators get close to the truth, or were they looking in completely the wrong direction? Because here's the problem, there was still no body, No physical evidence tying Gaudette to a crime. No forensic evidence. No confirmed murder scene. No weapon. Nothing that could turn suspicion into a prosecution. And that's the wall investigators kept hitting. They could suspect, they could question. They could search, but they couldn't prove. And without proof, Paula remained missing. The next chapter takes us into the most uncomfortable part of the case. Fred Gaudette. Who was he? What did investigators believe he knew? Why did his story matter? And why did suspicions surrounding him survive long after the original investigation ended? Because sometimes the most disturbing clue in an unsolved case isn't something investigators found. It's something a person said, and then tried to explain away. Chapter 3 will be The Man on Harbor Road, Fred Gaudette, where we'll carefully separate what is documented from what is later speculation. Chapter 3. The Man on Harbor Road. By now, investigators had a problem. They knew where Paula had been seen. They knew roughly which direction she had been traveling. They knew she had entered an area where very few people were around. But they still didn't know what happened after that. And when a person disappears without leaving a body, a clear trail or a reliable final witness, investigators naturally begin looking at the people who were nearby. One of those people was Fred Gaudette. Gaudette lived in the area near the Long Trail. He was a lumberman, and at some point after Paula disappeared, investigators began paying attention to him. Not because they had discovered some dramatic piece of physical evidence. They didn't. What drew their attention was his story, and more specifically, the changes in that story. Gaudette initially provided investigators with an account of his movements, but according to later accounts of the investigation, parts of his story didn't remain consistent. He eventually acknowledged that he had lied to police. That alone doesn't prove murder. People lie to police for many reasons. Sometimes they are frightened. Sometimes they are hiding something unrelated. Sometimes they simply don't want investigators examining their private lives. But when the person being questioned lives near the place where a young woman disappeared, even a relatively small lie becomes important. Investigators wanted to know, why had he lied? And what exactly was he trying to hide? The problem was that there was no easy answer. There wasn't a witness who could say, I saw Paula enter Gaudette's home. There wasn't a photograph, there wasn't a confession. There wasn't a body discovered on his property. And there wasn't a physical object that could definitively connect him to Paula. There was suspicion, there were questions, there were inconsistencies. But suspicion is not evidence of murder. That distinction would become crucial. Because over the years, some retellings of Paula's story made Gaudette sound almost like a confirmed killer. He wasn't, he was a person of interest, and the difference between those two descriptions is enormous. Investigators nevertheless examined the area around his property. They had good reason to do so. When someone disappears near a person's home, investigators have to consider the possibility that the disappearance happened there. They search the property, they examine surrounding terrain, they look for signs of disturbance. They question neighbors, they reconstruct movements, and they try to determine whether the person's story fits the physical evidence. But the investigation didn't produce the definitive discovery everyone was hoping for. Paula wasn't found, and without finding Paula, the investigation remained trapped in uncertainty. There is something else worth remembering about 1946. Forensic science was nowhere near what it is today. Modern investigators can use DNA. They can recover microscopic evidence. They can analyze digital information. They can compare databases. They can revisit old evidence with technologies that didn't exist when the crime happened. But investigators working in 1946 didn't have those tools. Even if something had been left behind, they might not have known how to interpret it. And if the evidence disappeared into the environment, it might have been gone forever. That creates an uncomfortable possibility. What if the answer was actually there? What if investigators walked past it? What if they searched the right area but didn't know what they were looking for? Or what if nothing was ever left behind at all? The investigation into Gaudette eventually reached a frustrating point. Authorities had questions, but they couldn't build a murder case. And Paula remained missing. This is where many true crime stories are tempted to create a neat ending. They choose a suspect, they explain the disappearance. They tell the audience that the mystery is solved. But reality doesn't work that way. Sometimes investigators suspect someone, and they're wrong. Sometimes the person really is responsible, but there isn't enough evidence to prove it. And sometimes the truth is something completely different. In Paula's case, we simply don't know. There was another possibility that investigators could never completely eliminate. Paula could have become lost. It sounds almost too simple. But simple explanations deserve consideration too. Imagine walking alone through unfamiliar mountain terrain. You believe you know where you're going. Then daylight begins disappearing. You realize the trail isn't as obvious as you expected. You take a wrong turn, then another. You think you'll find your way back. But now you're deeper in the woods. Your shoes are getting wet, the temperature is dropping, and the last light disappears. At that point, fear begins changing your judgment. You don't necessarily walk toward safety. You may walk toward what you think is safety, and every wrong decision takes you farther away. If Paula experienced something like that, she could have ended up somewhere searchers never expected. And the Vermont wilderness is large enough to hide a person. Then there was another possibility, one that becomes especially interesting when you consider Paula's age. She was 18, she was away at college. She was becoming an adult. Could she have simply decided to leave? Could she have intentionally disappeared? At first glance, that sounds possible. People do sometimes walk away from their old lives. They change their names. They move to another state. They cut contact with family. They start over. But Paula's case presents a problem. There was no clear evidence that she had planned to disappear. No suitcase packed with belongings. No obvious letter explaining her decision. No confirmed financial preparation. No reliable evidence that she had arranged another life somewhere else. And if she really did leave intentionally, why would she choose to disappear in the middle of winter? Why go toward a remote trail? Why leave so little behind? Again, we don't know. This is the point where the case divides into competing possibilities. Accident, foul play, voluntary disappearance, and eventually a fourth possibility. That the entire story has been distorted by decades of speculation. Maybe some of the clues we think are important aren't important at all. Maybe some witnesses remembered incorrectly. Maybe later stories added details that weren't part of the original investigation. Maybe the simplest answer has been overlooked because people prefer complicated mysteries. That happens. Once a case becomes famous, it develops a life of its own. Books are written, documentaries are made. People tell stories, and every retelling can add another layer. Eventually, it's difficult to separate the original case from the legend that grew around it. Paula's disappearance became especially vulnerable to that process because other people also disappeared in the wider Bennington area, and those cases began getting connected. One disappearance became two became several. And eventually people started talking about something they called the Bennington Triangle, a mysterious region where people supposedly vanished under strange circumstances. It sounds compelling, almost supernatural, but the term wasn't part of the original 1940s investigation. It appeared much later, and that's important. Because when we talk about the Bennington Triangle, we're no longer talking only about Paula. We're talking about a later interpretation of several unrelated cases, and the question becomes, were these disappearances actually connected? Or did people connect them because they happened in roughly the same part of Vermont? One of the other famous cases involved a man named Mitty Rivers. He disappeared in 1945. Another involved 8-year-old Paul Jepson. Then there was Frida Langer. And later, James Tedford. Different people, different circumstances, different time periods, and yet all became part of the same legend. Paula's case became the most famous of them all. And once the cases were grouped together, people began searching for a common explanation. Some suggested geography, others suggested the weather, some pointed toward human predators, and eventually, some people began talking about something much stranger. But before we go there, we need to understand what was actually happening in Vermont, because the truth about Paula's disappearance is already strange enough, and the real historical consequences of her case were about to become enormous. The investigation had exposed something bigger than one missing student. It exposed problems in rural law enforcement. Coordination was difficult, resources were limited. Communication wasn't what it is today, and when a major disappearance crossed jurisdictional boundaries, there wasn't a modern statewide police organization ready to take control. Paula's disappearance became one of the events associated with a growing demand for better statewide policing. In 1947, Vermont established its first statewide police force, the Vermont State Police. That institution would go on to become an important part of Vermont's history. So Paula's disappearance didn't just leave a family without answers. It helped expose a weakness in the state's ability to respond to major crimes. Her name became part of the story of how Vermont changed the way it policed itself. But for Paula's father, none of that could replace his daughter. A new police force couldn't bring her home. A newspaper article couldn't bring her home. A reward couldn't bring her home. And every theory about what happened was still only a theory. Imagine waiting for years without knowing whether your daughter was dead or alive. That's the cruelest part of an unsolved disappearance. Death is devastating, but uncertainty can become its own kind of suffering. There is no funeral, no final photograph, no grave to visit, no confirmed final moment, just a question. Where is she? And that question remained. Years passed. Then decades, the original investigators were gone. Witnesses aged, memories faded. The people who had known Paula personally grew older. Some died, and the possibility of solving the case became smaller. But the mystery didn't disappear. Instead, it grew. Paula's name appeared in books. Her disappearance became part of Vermont folklore. And eventually, a new generation began asking the same question investigators had asked in 1946. What happened to Paula Welden? But by then, there was another story attached to her disappearance. A story involving strange disappearances, the Bennington Triangle, and the possibility that something unusual was happening in those mountains. Was there really something mysterious about the area? Or was this simply the way humans make sense of unexplained events? Because when we can't explain something, we tend to create explanations, and sometimes those explanations become more famous than the facts. Chapter 4. The Bennington Triangle, Mystery or Myth. There is a point in almost every unsolved case when the facts stop being enough for people. They want an explanation, not a possibility. Not a question, an explanation. And when the explanation isn't there, people start connecting dots. That's exactly what happened around Bennington, Vermont. Paula Welden wasn't the only person to disappear in the region. There had been other unexplained disappearances. Different people, different circumstances, but the same general area. And eventually, those cases became connected in the public imagination. The name that emerged was dramatic: the Bennington Triangle. It sounds like a place marked on a map, but there isn't an official geographical location called the Bennington Triangle. It isn't a government-designated zone. It wasn't a term investigators used during Paula's disappearance. It's a label that developed much later, and that distinction is important, because if we're going to understand what happened to Paula, we need to separate the historical case from the legend that grew around it. The story usually begins with a man named Mitty Rivers. Rivers was a longtime resident of the area and an experienced outdoorsman. In November 1945, he went hunting with a group near Glastonbury Mountain. He knew the woods. He wasn't an inexperienced visitor who had accidentally wandered into unfamiliar terrain. He understood the area, and yet, he disappeared. According to historical accounts, Rivers was carrying a rifle and ammunition when he vanished. Searchers went looking for him. His body was eventually found in a stream. That fact alone is important, because unlike Paula's case, Rivers was found. There was at least a physical conclusion, but the circumstances of his death remained unclear, and people remembered the case. Then about a year later, Paula Welden disappeared. Suddenly, there were two unexplained incidents in the same general region. People noticed, then came another. In December 1949, an 8-year-old boy named Paul Jepson disappeared. Paul had been traveling with his mother near Somerset. She reportedly left him in a truck while she went about her work. When she returned, he was gone. Searchers were called. The area was examined. But Paul wasn't found. He was only 8 years old. And unlike an experienced adult hiker, he couldn't have traveled enormous distances without eventually becoming exhausted. That made the disappearance especially disturbing. Again, the question was, where did he go? Then came Frida Langer. In October 1950, Frida went hiking with her cousin near Somerset Reservoir. During the hike, she fell into the water. She returned to camp to change clothes, and then she disappeared. Her cousin expected her to come back. She didn't. Searchers began looking. This time, something unusual happened. Frida's body was eventually found, but it wasn't found in some impossible hidden location. It was discovered in an open area that had apparently been searched before. That detail helped fuel the mystery. How could searchers have missed her? Had they simply overlooked the location? Had weather changed the landscape? Had the body been moved? Or was the search simply less thorough than people later imagined? We don't know. But the story became another piece of the Bennington puzzle. And then there was James Tedford. Tedford was a retired soldier. In December 1949, he was traveling by bus. At some point during the journey, he disappeared. Other passengers had seen him. He had belongings with him. And yet, by the time the bus arrived, Tedford was gone. His luggage reportedly remained behind. Again, a person had disappeared. Again, there was no simple explanation. And now people had several cases. Mitty Rivers, Paula Welden, Paul Jepson, Frida Langer, James Tedford, all associated with the same broad region, all strange, all unresolved in different ways. And eventually, someone decided they belonged together. This is where we have to slow down. Because connecting cases doesn't automatically mean they're connected. If 5 people disappear in the same large geographical area over several years, there are 2 ways to look at it. One possibility is that there is a common cause. The other is that humans naturally notice patterns. We see connections because connections make uncertainty easier to understand. Think about a city. Thousands of people disappear every year. Most cases have ordinary explanations. Some are accidents, some are voluntary disappearances. Some involve crime, some involve mental health crises. Some involve people simply losing contact with their families. Now imagine taking 5 unusual cases from the same region and putting them together. Suddenly, it looks like something is happening, but that doesn't prove that anything is. That's the central problem with the Bennington Triangle. The mystery may be real, the connection may not be. There is also a geographical problem. The Bennington area contains mountains, forests, reservoirs, roads, and enormous stretches of wilderness. It's not a tiny neighborhood. It's not a single park with one entrance and one exit. It's a large landscape. People can become lost. People can fall. People can suffer exposure. People can disappear into terrain where search teams struggle to find them. That means some of the disappearances may have perfectly ordinary explanations that simply weren't discoverable at the time. And 1940s and 1950s search technology was limited. No GPS, no satellite imaging, no drones, no thermal cameras, no digital mapping. Even helicopters were not the search tools they are today. If someone disappeared into dense forest, the searchers had to physically go looking. And that takes time. But the Bennington Triangle story became more dramatic than that. Some later accounts began suggesting that the area itself was somehow unusual. People talked about strange lights, unexplained phenomena, possible paranormal activity. Some stories even connected the disappearances to supernatural forces. And once those stories entered the public imagination, they became difficult to remove. A mysterious mountain region is an attractive setting for a mystery. A young woman disappearing into the woods is already compelling. Add several other disappearances and then add rumors of strange phenomena, and you have a legend. But a legend is not the same thing as evidence. There is no established scientific evidence that some supernatural force caused Paula Welden to disappear. There is no verified evidence that an unknown creature carried her away. There is no reliable evidence that the region contains some kind of dimensional portal. Those ideas belong to folklore and speculation, not established fact. And that's why the real mystery is actually more interesting, because we don't need a supernatural explanation. We already have an unanswered disappearance. There's another possibility worth considering. Could the geography itself explain some of the disappearances? The Green Mountains can be unforgiving. Weather changes quickly. Visibility can disappear. Trails can be confusing. Waterways can become dangerous. And a person who is injured may not be able to reach a road. Even an experienced outdoorsman can become vulnerable under the wrong circumstances. Mitty Rivers knew the area, yet he died. Frida Langer was hiking with someone, yet she disappeared. Paul Jepson was a child, and he vanished from a relatively limited area. These cases are different, and that's exactly why treating them as one mystery can be misleading. Now return to Paula, because Paula's disappearance has one major difference. We have a reasonably strong account of where she was headed. She wasn't simply wandering randomly. She was going toward the long trail. She had asked people about it. She was seen walking toward the area and then, nothing. If Paula became lost, the location of her last confirmed sighting becomes crucial. If she was abducted, the same location becomes crucial. If she voluntarily left, the same location becomes crucial. Everything leads back to that final stretch of road and trail. And that means one question remains more important than all the theories. What happened during those final minutes? Imagine the scene. It's late afternoon. The temperature is dropping. The sun is moving lower. Paula is walking. She may be thinking about the trail. Maybe she's thinking about school. Maybe she's thinking about home. Maybe she's simply enjoying the quiet. She doesn't know people will soon be searching for her. She doesn't know her photograph will appear in newspapers. She doesn't know investigators will question strangers about her. She doesn't know her name will become associated with one of Vermont's most famous mysteries. From her perspective, this is just an afternoon, and then she reaches a point beyond which no one can reliably tell us what happened. That's the real triangle, not 3 points on a map, not a supernatural zone, a gap in human knowledge, a space between the last confirmed sighting and the rest of Paula's life. And that gap is where theories grow. One theory says she became lost. Another says she suffered an accident. Another says someone abducted her. Another suggests she may have intentionally disappeared. And then there are theories that connect her disappearance to the other Bennington cases. Each theory has something going for it, and each has problems. That's why the case remains unsolved. If one explanation perfectly matched the evidence, the mystery wouldn't have survived this long. But there is something else about Paula's case that makes it particularly haunting. She wasn't some unknown traveler passing through Vermont. She had a family, she was a college student. People knew her, people expected her to return, and her disappearance had consequences beyond her own life. The case became part of a broader discussion about law enforcement in Vermont. The search exposed weaknesses, and in the aftermath, Vermont created a statewide police organization. The Vermont State Police was established in 1947, so Paula's disappearance became part of the history of the state's law enforcement system. That's an extraordinary legacy for an 18-year-old who simply went for a walk. But for her family, the institutional changes meant nothing compared with one simple question. Where was Paula? Years passed. The people who had searched for her grew older. The witnesses who had seen her became elderly. Some died. And every passing year reduced the chance that someone would suddenly remember something that could solve the case. Yet the mystery remained. And then another strange thing happened. Paula's disappearance began influencing popular culture. Her story became connected with literature. A novel published years later would be associated with the case. The author was Shirley Jackson, and the book was Hankseman. Jackson had a connection to Bennington College, and the disappearance of Paula Welden has often been discussed in connection with the novel. But once again, we need to be careful. Influence isn't proof. A fictional story inspired by a real disappearance doesn't reveal what actually happened. It tells us something else. It shows how deeply Paula's disappearance entered the cultural memory of the region. The case wasn't just an unsolved police file anymore. It had become part of Vermont's mythology. And mythology can be dangerous, because once a story becomes famous, people begin remembering the story instead of the evidence. They remember the red coat, the mountains, the mysterious disappearances, the triangle, the legends, the strange theories. But sometimes the simplest facts get buried. An 18-year-old woman left college. She went walking. She was seen near the long trail, and she never came home. That's enough. We don't need to add anything. The unanswered question is already enormous. So was the Bennington Triangle real? If by real we mean a mysterious geographical force causing people to vanish, there is no reliable evidence for that. If we mean that several people disappeared in the same broad region under circumstances that remain partly unexplained, yes. That part is real, and that's where the distinction matters. The mystery isn't imaginary, but the explanation may be. And until we have evidence, we shouldn't pretend to know which one it is. Perhaps Paula fell somewhere in the wilderness. Perhaps she encountered someone who intended her harm. Perhaps she accepted a ride. Perhaps she walked farther than anyone realized. Perhaps she left voluntarily. Or perhaps the truth is something nobody has considered. That's the uncomfortable reality of cold cases. Sometimes the answer isn't hidden because it's impossible. It's hidden because the evidence disappeared with the person. And in Paula's case, the evidence may have disappeared more than 70 years ago. There is one final question. If Paula's body was somewhere in those mountains, could modern technology still find her? That question is worth exploring, because search technology has changed dramatically. Satellite imagery, ground-penetrating radar, modern mapping, improved forensic techniques, DNA databases, modern missing person databases, and new methods for searching difficult terrain. Could any of those tools finally provide an answer? Or has too much time passed? The next chapter looks at exactly that question. And it takes us away from the legends and back to the evidence. Because after more than 7 decades, the question isn't simply what happened to Paula. It's also, is there anything left that can still tell us? Chapter 5. The evidence that disappeared with her. The most frustrating part of Paula Welden's disappearance wasn't that there were no clues. There were clues, there were witnesses. There were descriptions, there were roads. There were trails, and there were people who remembered seeing her. Search teams also covered huge areas of Vermont wilderness, but the problem was, none of those clues could be connected into one complete story. And that's what makes a cold case so difficult. A mystery may have one missing piece. A cold case can have hundreds of pieces, and still reveal no clear answer. When investigators began searching for Paula, they faced something modern investigators rarely deal with. Almost no digital evidence. There was no cell phone. No text messages, no GPS, no social media. No credit card records showing where she went, and no network of surveillance cameras covering the roads. If Paula entered another vehicle after she was last seen, there might be no record of that journey. If she walked into the wood, there might be no record of that either. And if something happened to her there, the wilderness could hide the evidence before investigators ever found it. That was the reality facing investigators. Fortunately, they had a reliable description. Paula was 18 years old. She was about 5 feet 5 inches tall. She weighed around 122 pounds. She had brown hair and brown eyes. She was believed to be wearing a red hooded parka, blue jeans, and sneakers. Her photograph was circulated to law enforcement agencies. It was also published in newspapers and on posters. Eventually, thousands of people would see her face. The hope was simple. Someone had seen Paula. Maybe they didn't know her name. Maybe they didn't know she was missing. But if they saw her photograph, they might remember something. That was how investigations worked in that era. Information traveled through newspapers, radio, posters, police bulletins, and word of mouth. Every person who saw Paula's photograph was another possible witness. But there was one major problem. A photograph could show investigators what Paula looked like. It couldn't tell them where she went. And that was the question investigators needed answered. Where did Paula go after she was last seen? Did she continue into the mountains? Did she turn around? Did she leave the trail? Did someone pick her up? Did she meet someone? Did she enter a building? Or did she follow another road? Every possibility created another place to search. And the search area was enormous. Search teams entered the wilderness. They weren't looking casually. They were looking for anything. A piece of clothing, a footprint, a personal belonging, a possible shelter, or anything else that could reveal where Paula had gone. But the Vermont wilderness made everything harder. Dense forests, steep ridges, streams, uneven ground, cold temperatures, and eventually in winter, snow may look beautiful. But for investigators, snow can destroy evidence. Footprints disappear, small objects become buried, familiar areas change completely, and movement becomes much more difficult. A clue visible one day could disappear the next. A footprint could be covered. A piece of clothing could become buried, and important evidence could remain hidden beneath the landscape. The longer the search continued, the more the wilderness became part of the mystery. Still, searchers continued. The FBI became involved. A reward was offered. Paula's photograph and description were widely distributed. Her disappearance received significant attention. People wanted answers. Families wanted answers. Investigators wanted answers, but pressure alone cannot create evidence. Eventually, the searches began producing fewer results. Teams had searched the obvious areas. They had followed leads, they had questioned witnesses. They had examined the surrounding wilderness. And still, Paula was nowhere to be found. This reveals one of the biggest misconceptions about cold cases. People sometimes think, if hundreds of people search the area, nothing could possibly remain hidden. But that's not necessarily true. Even experienced searchers can miss something. A small object can disappear beneath vegetation. A footprint can be destroyed by weather. A hidden location can remain untouched. And search teams cannot examine every inch of a mountain equally. They search the areas they believe are most likely. But what if that assumption was wrong? What if Paula went somewhere nobody thought to search? Then the most important clue could still be somewhere in Vermont, waiting to be found. There was another problem. Investigators were working with an incomplete timeline. They knew Paula had left Bennington College. They knew she traveled toward the trail. They knew she was seen, but the exact sequence of every minute wasn't known. That matters enormously. Imagine investigators knew. 2:30, Paula leaves campus. Then 3:30, Paula is seen somewhere along the route. Then 4:15. Paula is seen near the trail. But what happened between those moments? Who picked her up? Who saw her? Where exactly did she stop? How long did she remain in each location? Those gaps create opportunities for an unknown event, and when investigators can't fill them, the entire timeline becomes uncertain. This is also where witness testimony becomes complicated. Suppose someone sees Paula for 10 seconds. Years later, investigators ask, what direction was she walking? The witness may remember, but perhaps they remember incorrectly. Maybe the sun was behind her. Maybe the witness was driving. Maybe they were distracted. Maybe they saw another woman. Maybe they remember the red coat but not the face. And then, decades later, someone writes down that recollection. Now the memory becomes part of the historical record, but it doesn't necessarily become fact. That's why serious investigators distinguish between confirmed sighting and possible sighting. That distinction can completely change a case. And then there's the most painful possibility. What if Paula's remains were found, but nobody realized they were hers? It sounds unlikely. But unidentified remains cases exist for exactly this reason. Before modern DNA databases, identifying an unknown person could be incredibly difficult. A body without identification could remain unidentified for years. In Paula's case, however, no confirmed remains have ever been established as hers. And that leaves the central question intact. Where did she go? Another theory is that Paula survived. It's one of the most emotionally complicated possibilities. Because if she survived, then the disappearance wasn't the end. It was a beginning, a new identity, a new place, a new life. Maybe she deliberately cut contact. Maybe she wanted freedom. Maybe she wanted to escape something. Maybe she simply decided never to return. But again, there is no confirmed evidence proving this, and that's important. The absence of a body doesn't automatically mean a person survived, but it also doesn't prove that they died. That is the terrible uncertainty families of missing people live with. For Paula's family, every possible sighting would have carried enormous emotional weight. Imagine receiving a phone call. Someone thinks they saw your daughter. For a moment, hope returns. Maybe she's alive, maybe she's somewhere nearby, maybe she needs help. Maybe after all these years when she can finally come home. Then investigators check the lead. And nothing. Another false alarm. Another possible sighting that leads nowhere. Another door closing, then another. And another. That cycle can continue for decades. Paula's father continued searching. The family offered a reward. Her photograph remained associated with the case. And the investigation became part of Vermont's history. But there was no moment when investigators could finally say, this is what happened. That's the part that makes the case different from many famous murders. There isn't even a confirmed crime scene. There isn't a confirmed victim of homicide. There isn't a body. There isn't a confession. There isn't a final piece of evidence. There's only a missing woman. And then, the story became bigger than Paula. Her disappearance became connected with the other missing person cases around Bennington. That's how the Bennington Triangle legend grew. But once again, we have to separate what is known from what was added later. The disappearances are real. The mysteries are real. But there is no established evidence that they were caused by one common supernatural phenomenon. That's an important distinction, because the real history is already fascinating, and sometimes, the truth is more unsettling than the legend. Consider what Paula's disappearance tells us about the world of 1946. A young woman could leave a college campus and walk toward a mountain and then disappear. And the modern tools we take for granted simply didn't exist. No location history, no digital camera recording her movements, no automated license plate cameras, no cell towers creating a record of where her phone traveled, no DNA evidence waiting to be tested, no internet, no social media, no digital payments. The world was quieter, but that quiet made disappearances much harder to solve. But there is still another side to this story. Because Paula's disappearance didn't just become a cold case. It became part of a cultural story, a story about a mysterious mountain region, a story about other missing people, a story that would eventually inspire books, theories, documentaries, and legends. And one particular novel has repeatedly been connected to Paula's disappearance. The novel was written by someone who knew Bennington College intimately. Her name was Shirley Jackson, and what happened next would take Paula's disappearance from the police files and into American literature. Chapter 6. The Novel, the College, and the Shadow of Paula Welden. By this point, Paula Welden had become more than a missing person case. Her photograph had appeared in newspapers. Her disappearance had generated one of the largest searches Vermont had seen. Her name had become associated with the creation of a statewide police force. And yet, for all the attention surrounding her, Paula herself was slowly becoming a memory. That is one of the strangest things about famous disappearances. The person disappears first, then the investigation. Then eventually the real person can disappear behind the story. People remember the mystery. They remember the red coat. They remember the mountains. They remember the phrase Bennington Triangle. But Paula was a real 18-year-old woman with a real life, and she had attended a college that would later become deeply connected with one of America's most famous writers. Her name was Shirley Jackson. Shirley Jackson is probably best known today for works like The Haunting of Hill House and We Have Always Lived in the Castle. But before she became famous, she had a connection to Bennington College. Jackson's time at the college gave her an understanding of the institution, its students, and the strange social atmosphere of a small liberal arts college. And years later, she wrote a novel called Hangsaman. The book was published in 1951, and almost immediately, people began discussing its similarities to the disappearance of Paula Welden. That connection has continued for decades. But here's where we need to be careful. A fictional novel is not evidence of what happened to Paula, and similarities between fiction and reality don't automatically mean the author knew something investigators didn't. Sometimes writers simply absorb the world around them. They hear stories, they notice people, they remember places, and those impressions become fiction. But the connection is still fascinating. Because Hangsaman centers on a young college student whose world becomes increasingly strange and uncertain. The atmosphere is psychological, uncomfortable, ambiguous. The boundaries between reality and perception begin to blur. And because Jackson had a connection to Bennington, readers naturally wondered whether Paula's disappearance had influenced the book. Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. There's no simple answer, but the question itself tells us something. Paula's disappearance had become part of the atmosphere surrounding the college. Students knew about it, faculty knew about it, the community knew about it. A young woman had disappeared from the college environment and never returned. That kind of event doesn't simply vanish from collective memory. Imagine being a student at Bennington in the years after Paula disappeared. You walk through the same campus. You see the same buildings. You hear stories about the missing girl. Maybe older students talk about her. Maybe faculty members remember the search. Maybe newspapers still carry the photograph. And somewhere beyond the campus, while the mountains remain, that would create an atmosphere unlike an ordinary college experience. The wilderness wasn't just scenery. It had become associated with danger, with uncertainty, with something unfinished. And that's part of why Paula's story continued to resonate. But the cultural memory of Paula didn't stop with literature. Over the decades, newspapers continued revisiting the disappearance. Historians examined the case. Writers discussed the Bennington disappearances. And eventually, the internet transformed the case completely. Suddenly, anyone could research Paula. Anyone could publish a theory. Anyone could connect her disappearance to another case. Anyone could create a map of the supposed Bennington Triangle. And anyone could repeat a rumor. That created both opportunity and danger, because the internet can preserve information, but it can also preserve misinformation. A claim repeated 1,000 times can begin to look like a fact. Even when nobody can identify where it originally came from, that's something worth remembering when researching old mysteries. There are 3 categories of information: what we know, what investigators suspected, and what people later claimed. Those 3 things aren't interchangeable. For example, we know Paula disappeared. We know she was seen heading toward the long trail. We know an enormous search followed. We know investigators considered different possibilities, but we don't know exactly what happened to her. That's the boundary. And crossing it means turning speculation into false certainty. The same problem appears with Fred Gaudet, because the more the case was retold, the more his role became exaggerated. A person of interest can gradually become the killer in popular storytelling. A suspicious statement becomes a confession. A contradiction becomes proof. And suddenly, a case that was never solved appears solved. But history doesn't work that way. Gaudet was never convicted of murdering Paula. There is no definitive evidence establishing that he killed her. And because Paula was never found, the case never reached the point where a court could examine all the evidence. That means we have to leave room for uncertainty. There's another theory that deserves attention: the possibility that Paula may have intentionally disappeared. It's one of the hardest theories emotionally because it suggests something very different. Maybe she wasn't a victim. Maybe she chose to leave. Maybe she wanted another life. Maybe she was unhappy. Maybe she wanted to escape expectations. People sometimes do disappear intentionally, and when someone is never found, it's tempting to assume they must have died. But absence isn't proof of death. At the same time, there's no strong documented evidence establishing that Paula successfully created a new life elsewhere. No confirmed later identity, no verified photograph, no reliable communication, no proven sighting years later. So the voluntary disappearance theory remains exactly that, a theory. And there is a deeper problem. If Paula deliberately disappeared, why did she choose the mountains? Why did she leave without obvious preparations? Why was she seen heading toward the trail? Why did she apparently take so little with her? And why has no reliable trace of her surfaced? Those questions don't prove she didn't leave voluntarily, but they make the theory difficult to establish. Again, we return to uncertainty. The accident theory has a similar problem. It's completely plausible that an inexperienced hiker could become lost. It's plausible that she could have fallen. It's plausible that exposure could have killed her. But if that happened, where are her remains? The search was extensive, the region was examined. Yet no confirmed remains have been linked to Paula. That doesn't eliminate the theory, but it prevents us from calling it a solution. And the abduction theory has the opposite problem. If someone abducted Paula, how? Where? By whom? Was there a vehicle? Was there another person? Did someone offer her a ride? Was she forced? Did she willingly enter a vehicle? And where would the person have taken her? The further you go into the theory, the more questions appear. That's the frustrating pattern in this case. Every possible answer creates another unanswered question. Perhaps that's why the Bennington Triangle became so popular. It provides a single explanation for multiple mysteries, instead of saying, oh, several people disappeared under different circumstances. The legend says, something about this place causes people to disappear. It's emotionally satisfying, one cause, one location, one mystery. But reality is usually messier. Different people can disappear for completely different reasons. An experienced hunter can die in an accident. A child can wander away. A hiker can become lost. A person can encounter a criminal. Those events don't have to share one cause. There is another reason the legend became powerful. The landscape itself looks like the setting for a mystery. Mountains, dense forest, long trails, isolated roads. The mountains become suspicious, the silence becomes evidence. But silence isn't evidence, it's simply silence. For Paula's family, the mythology surrounding the case probably mattered very little. They didn't need a legend. They needed their daughter. Then you hope eventually, you start asking yourself whether you should accept the possibility that she's dead. But how do you accept something you cannot prove? How do you mourn someone whose body was never found? There is no grave, no final goodbye, no certainty, only the memory of who she was before December 1st, 1946. That is why missing person cases can remain emotionally unresolved for generations. The family doesn't receive the closure that comes with a confirmed death. Instead, they live with two possibilities. She could be gone forever, or she could somehow still be alive. And every year that passes makes both possibilities harder. Hope becomes painful, grief becomes uncertain, and the mystery becomes part of family history. Paula's case also raises an uncomfortable question about how quickly society forgets women who disappear. A young woman vanishes, the media reports it. People search, families wait, and eventually, the headlines disappear. News stories replace the old ones. The world moves forward, but the family doesn't. For them, December 1st never becomes an ordinary date. It remains the day everything changed, and perhaps that's one reason Paula's story has survived. Not because of supernatural theories, not because of the Bennington Triangle, and not simply because the case is mysterious, but because there is something deeply human about an unfinished story. We want endings, we want answers. We want to know what happened. We want to know where someone went. We want to know who was responsible. We want to close the book and finally move on. But Paula's story doesn't allow that. The final page is missing. And then there is the landscape. The long trail still exists. People still hike through Vermont. People still walk across those mountains. Some may pass places connected to Paula's disappearance without ever knowing what happened there. They may stop for photographs. They may admire the scenery. They may hear nothing except the wind moving through the trees. And somewhere within that landscape, there may still be an answer, or there may not. That's something no documentary can change. Modern technology has completely changed missing person investigations. Today, if someone disappears, their cell phone may become one of the first things investigators examine. Financial records can reveal movement. Security cameras can show direction. Digital messages can reveal relationships. Modern search teams can use advanced maps, aerial technology, and other tools unavailable decades ago. DNA technology can also identify remains that previous generations could never identify. But none of these tools can guarantee an answer. Technology can only work with evidence, and in Paula's case, the evidence may have disappeared with her. That brings us to one of the most important questions in this story. Could Paula still be found, not as a theory, not as a possibility discussed online, but physically? Could modern investigators discover something that searchers in 1946 simply missed? Could new technology reveal a hidden location? Could an old clue finally make sense? Could modern DNA testing identify remains that were never connected to Paula? It's possible, but possibility isn't the same as probability. And after more than 7 decades, the odds are impossible to know. There is another possibility. Someone may still know something. A family secret, a forgotten confession, an old letter, a diary, or a story passed down through generations. Perhaps someone once heard something about Paula, but never understood its importance. Perhaps a witness saw something but was afraid to speak. Perhaps someone told a relative something shortly before they died. Cold cases sometimes move forward because of tiny pieces of information that somehow survived for decades. And that's why investigators continue preserving old cases. Because time doesn't always destroy evidence, sometimes time reveals it. Chapter 7. The Search That Changed Vermont. By the time investigators realized Paula Welden wasn't simply late, the clock was already working against them. Every hour mattered, every mile mattered. Every person who might have seen her mattered. And somewhere beyond Bennington College, a young woman was missing in a landscape where winter could erase evidence with frightening speed. The first instinct was simple: find her, search the roads, search the trails, search the woods, talk to anyone who might have seen her, and keep going until someone finds something. But as the days passed, the search became something much larger. Paula's disappearance wasn't treated like an ordinary missing person report. Her photograph and description were circulated widely, and the FBI became involved in the investigation. Contemporary FBI records describe her as missing from Bennington, Vermont, and provide a detailed physical description for law enforcement agencies. That tells us something important about how seriously the disappearance was being treated. Authorities weren't simply waiting for Paula to return. They were actively trying to locate her, and the public was being asked to help, because investigators knew something that remains true in missing person cases today. Sometimes the smallest observation becomes the most important clue. A person remembers a face, a vehicle, a conversation, a strange movement, something that seemed completely meaningless at the time, and suddenly it becomes the key to the case. Searchers moved through the surrounding wilderness. The terrain was difficult, but the bigger problem was uncertainty. Where exactly should they concentrate their efforts? If Paula was still somewhere near the long trail, the search needed to move outward from there. But what if she had turned around? What if she had accepted another ride? What if she had followed another road? What if someone had taken her somewhere else? Every possibility created a completely different search area, and without a confirmed final location, investigators couldn't simply draw a circle on a map and search everything inside it. The possible area was enormous. Imagine trying to search a mountain without knowing whether the person you're looking for is actually there. You walk through the woods, you examine trails, you check ravines, you look under trees, you scan open areas. Then you reach the end of the search zone. Nothing. So you expand it another mile, then another, still nothing. You return to the original area. You search it again, still nothing. And eventually the question becomes terrifying. What if we're searching in the wrong place? That possibility may have been one of the greatest obstacles in Paula's case. Searchers can only search the information they're given. If the last reliable sighting is wrong, the entire search can be wrong. If a witness misremembered the direction Paula was traveling, searchers could spend days looking in the wrong part of the mountain. If Paula entered a vehicle, the search could be happening miles away from where she actually was. And if someone intentionally moved her, the original search area could become almost irrelevant. This is why the final confirmed sighting is so important. It isn't simply a historical detail. It's the foundation of the entire investigation. The case also became a media story. Newspapers carried Paula's photograph. Her disappearance captured public attention. The fact that she was a college student made the story particularly striking. She wasn't expected to disappear. She wasn't living as a fugitive. She wasn't known as someone who routinely vanished. She was an 18-year-old student who went hiking, then she didn't come back. That simplicity made the story frightening. Because if it could happen to Paula, people naturally wondered whether it could happen to someone else. And that fear mattered. The case wasn't only about finding one missing woman anymore. It raised questions about safety, about rural policing, about how quickly authorities could respond to disappearances, about communication between different law enforcement agencies, and about whether Vermont had enough resources to handle major investigations. Those questions would become increasingly important. At the time, Vermont did not have the modern statewide police system people know today. Law enforcement was largely local. Different communities had their own structures. That could create difficulties when an investigation extended beyond one town or jurisdiction. Paula's disappearance demonstrated just how complicated that could become. A person could disappear in one area, but evidence might exist somewhere else. Witnesses might live in another town. Search teams might cross multiple jurisdictions, and without a strong centralized organization, coordination could be difficult. Then something significant happened. In 1947, Vermont established the Vermont State Police. The creation of the organization followed a period when Vermont officials were increasingly concerned about statewide law enforcement needs. Paula's disappearance became part of the historical context surrounding that change. It would be too simplistic to say, Paula disappeared, therefore the Vermont State Police was created. History is rarely that simple, but her case was one of the events that demonstrated the need for stronger statewide coordination. And that is a remarkable legacy. A disappearance that remained unsolved helped expose a system that needed to change. But for Paula's family, institutional change wasn't the answer they wanted. They didn't need a new police organization. They needed their daughter. They wanted a phone call, a photograph, a confirmed sighting, anything. And as the weeks became months, hope would have been mixed with something far more painful: uncertainty. Think about what happens when someone is missing for one day. People are worried. After 1 week, they're terrified. After 1 month, the situation feels different. After 1 year, people begin speaking about the person in the past tense. But what happens after 10 years, 20, 30? The disappearance becomes part of family history. The missing person remains frozen at the age they were when they disappeared. Everyone else grows older, but Paula remains 18. Forever. That's one of the strangest psychological effects of a long-term disappearance. We imagine the missing person exactly as they were. Paula doesn't age in photographs. She doesn't graduate, she doesn't get older. There is no confirmed later photograph showing what she might have looked like at 30, at 40, at 50. Her last known image remains the young woman who walked toward the mountains in 1946, and that photograph became the face of an unanswered question. The investigation also created another problem. As time passed, more people became interested in the mystery. Some genuinely wanted to help. Others simply wanted an explanation. And those two motivations aren't always the same. A researcher might say, "We don't know." A storyteller might say, "Here's what probably happened." And the second version is usually more satisfying, but it can also be more dangerous. Because once a theory becomes popular, people begin treating it like fact. That happened with the theories surrounding Paula. Some people focused on the wilderness. Others focused on Fred Godet. Others connected the disappearance to the so-called Bennington Triangle. And others believed Paula may have intentionally disappeared. Each theory attracted supporters, each had weaknesses, and none produced the one thing that would settle the case: Paula herself. There is a brutal simplicity to that. All the theories could disappear tomorrow if Paula were found. A body would change the investigation. A living Paula would change it even more. A confirmed piece of physical evidence could rewrite decades of speculation. But without that evidence, the theories remain theories. And that is why investigators continued to rely on the basics: witnesses, documents, searches, descriptions, physical locations, and time. But time was their enemy. Every year that passed meant fewer people who could remember the events firsthand. Eventually, the original witnesses began disappearing too. Not because they were involved, simply because people age. And when witnesses die, their memories die with them. Imagine being one of the people who saw Paula that afternoon. Maybe you remember her clearly. Maybe you remember the red coat. Maybe you remember her asking about the trail. And perhaps you think, I wish I had asked her more questions. Where were you going? Who were you meeting? Were you alone? Why were you hiking? Did you have somewhere to stay? Did anyone follow you? A normal conversation suddenly becomes the conversation you replay for the rest of your life. That's one of the cruelest aspects of unsolved cases. The people who witness the final ordinary moments often don't realize they're witnessing them. There is no dramatic music, no warning, no sense that history is being created. It's just an ordinary afternoon until it isn't. And then there is the question of the search itself. Could searchers have missed Paula? Absolutely. Even large searches have limitations. They depend on terrain, weather, visibility, manpower, information, and assumptions. A search team can be standing close to the truth without knowing it. The person they're looking for may be hidden behind terrain, under vegetation, inside a ravine, beyond a ridge, or somewhere outside the search area entirely. The absence of a discovery doesn't necessarily prove the person wasn't there. It may only prove that the search didn't find them. That distinction matters when discussing Paula, because people sometimes say they searched the area so she couldn't have been there. That's too certain. We simply don't know. Searches are not perfect, especially searches conducted more than 70 years ago. Modern investigators would approach the case differently. They might create detailed geographic models. They might reconstruct every known movement. They might identify likely travel routes. They could use terrain analysis. They could examine archival material. They could compare missing person records. They might use modern forensic databases. And if unidentified remains were ever located, DNA could potentially provide an answer. But there is one enormous obstacle. Nobody knows exactly where to look. That's the problem with the disappearance. A murder investigation usually starts with a crime scene, a body, blood, a weapon, a damaged vehicle, something. Paula's case doesn't have a confirmed crime scene. It has a last known location. That's very different. A last known location tells you she was here. A crime scene tells you something happened here. Investigators had the first. They never established the second. And that difference has kept the case open in the public imagination for decades. But perhaps the most important thing to remember is this. Paula's disappearance was never officially solved. There is no confirmed killer, no confirmed abductor, no confirmed accident, no confirmed voluntary disappearance, no confirmed final resting place. Anything that claims otherwise is going beyond the evidence. And for a documentary about a real person, that's a line worth protecting. Because Paula deserves more than becoming a character in someone else's theory. She deserves the truth, even if the truth is still unknown. And that brings us to another uncomfortable question. If investigators never found Paula, what happened to the search? Did it simply stop? Did authorities eventually move on? Were there later attempts to find her? Did new information ever appear? And what happened to the case after the people who originally investigated it were gone? Because sometimes, the most interesting part of a cold case begins after the original investigation ends. Chapter 8, when the search went cold eventually. Every search has to slow down. Not because the missing person has been found. Not because investigators stopped caring. But because there are only so many places that can be searched. And only so many times those places can be searched. For Paula Welden, that moment eventually arrived. The urgency of those first days began to disappear. The crowds became smaller. The headlines became less frequent, and the mountains remained silent. In the beginning, there had been activity everywhere. Police search teams, volunteers, students, people walking through the wilderness and looking for anything that could explain where Paula had gone. Every possible clue mattered. Every reported sighting was investigated. Every new piece of information created another moment of hope. But as the days passed without finding Paula, the investigation slowly changed. It became less about finding her immediately, and more about discovering what might have happened to her. That's a very different kind of investigation. When someone first disappears, investigators think about survival. Maybe the person is injured. Maybe they're lost. Maybe they're hiding somewhere. Maybe they're still alive. Time becomes critical. Every hour matters. But as more time passes, those assumptions begin to change. Search teams start considering a much darker possibility. The person may no longer be alive. Investigators begin searching for remains. instead of searching for someone they can rescue. And families are forced to face a possibility they desperately don't want to accept. But in Paula's case, even that answer never came. There was no confirmed body, no confirmed burial site, no confirmed location, nothing that allowed her family to say, "This is where Paula is." Without that answer, her disappearance remained unresolved, not necessarily as an active investigation every single day, but as a case without an ending. Years passed. The world changed. The people who searched for Paula grew older. Some eventually passed away. New generations grew up in Vermont without ever knowing her. To them, Paula was no longer the young woman people remembered. She became a photograph, a name, a story, and eventually a mystery. That's what happens to many old cases. The investigation slowly becomes separated from the people who experienced it. Original witnesses disappear. Old newspapers become historical records. Police files become archived documents, and researchers begin rebuilding the story from whatever evidence survived. A newspaper clipping, a police report, a witness statement, a photograph, a letter, sometimes even a single sentence in an old book. Every fragment can matter, but fragments can also create confusion. Because when the complete story is missing, people naturally try to fill the gaps. One witness remembers something, another remembers it differently. People begin deciding which version sounds more believable. If someone behaves strangely, people may assume there was a hidden reason. If several people disappeared in the same region, some begin believing the cases must be connected. And when nobody can explain what happened, supernatural theories can become tempting. That's how legends grow. The legend of the Bennington Triangle didn't appear overnight. It developed through stories. One disappearance, then another. Then another. People began noticing similarities. Eventually, the idea of the Bennington Triangle became part of the larger story. But Paula's disappearance happened long before that phrase became widely known. And that distinction matters. The Bennington Triangle is a later framework. Paula's disappearance is the historical event. They shouldn't be treated as though they are the same thing. And yet, the legend gave Paula's story a second life. People who had never heard her name started learning about her. Researchers returned to the case. Documentaries explored the mystery. Books discussed the disappearance. Online communities developed their own theories. Suddenly, a case slowly fading into history was attracting attention again. But renewed attention doesn't necessarily mean new evidence. Sometimes, it simply means more people are discussing the same old evidence. And that's one of the biggest challenges with famous cold cases. Attention can help, but attention can also create noise. A new witness might genuinely remember something important, or they might remember a story they heard years earlier. A researcher might discover an overlooked document, or they might discover a rumor. That has been repeated so many times it begins to look like fact. The internet makes both possibilities easier, and that's why sources matter. Where did the information come from? Was it recorded at the time? Was it reported by investigators? Was it written years later? Was it repeated by another author? Or did someone simply post it online? Those questions matter, because when speculation becomes mixed with evidence, a mystery can become even harder to understand. Paula's disappearance is a perfect example. There are facts we can state with confidence. She was 18 years old. She attended Bennington College. She left campus in December 1946 and was heading toward the Long Trail. Other people reported seeing her, but she never returned. A large search followed, and the FBI eventually became involved. But Paula was never conclusively found. Those are the foundations of the case. Everything beyond them needs to be treated carefully. And then there is Fred Gaudet. For years, his name remained connected to the investigation. He had attracted the attention of investigators, and some of his statements raised questions. But no definitive evidence proved that he killed Paula. That means we have to be careful not to turn suspicion into certainty. It's possible he knew something. It's possible he knew nothing. It's possible investigators had good reasons to suspect him. It's also possible they were looking at the wrong person. Without Paula, we simply cannot know, and that's an uncomfortable answer. But sometimes the uncomfortable answer is the most honest one. Imagine a courtroom. A prosecutor stands before a jury and says, "We believe this is what happened." The defense responds, "Where is the evidence?" And that's the problem. A theory can explain something, but an explanation isn't proof. A suspect can appear suspicious, but suspicion isn't guilt. And a missing person can be presumed dead without anyone knowing exactly how they died. There is also another possibility that has never completely disappeared. Maybe Paula survived, maybe somewhere she built another life. That theory continues partly because no body was ever found. But surviving would require much more than simply disappearing. She would have needed to create a completely different life, avoid people who might recognize her, avoid records connecting her to her old identity, and somehow remain undiscovered for decades. It's possible, but there is no confirmed evidence showing that happened. Once again, we reach the same wall, no proof. And perhaps that's exactly why Paula's disappearance has remained in the public imagination for so long. There is enough information to create theories, but not enough information to completely eliminate them. If her remains had been discovered in 1947, the mystery would have been very different. If Paula had returned home a week later, the mystery would have ended. If someone had confessed, the investigation would have had a clear direction. But none of those things happened. Instead, the case remained suspended in time. Then the years became decades. 1946 became 1956, 1956 became 1966, then 1976, then 1986, then 1996. And eventually the disappearance crossed into another century. Think about that. Paula disappeared before television became a dominant part of American life, before personal computers became common, before the internet, before smartphones, before DNA profiling transformed criminal investigations. She disappeared in a world that barely resembles our own. And yet her case survived into the digital age. By the time people began researching Paula's disappearance online, they weren't simply looking at a missing college student. They were looking at a historical mystery. And that changed the way her story spread. Instead of appearing only in Vermont newspapers, her case could now reach people thousands of miles away. Someone in another country could learn Paula's name. They could see photographs, read theories, watch documentaries, discuss the Bennington Triangle, and ask the same question investigators were asking in 1946. What happened to Paula? But there is something uncomfortable about turning an unsolved disappearance into entertainment. Because for an audience, it's a mystery. For Paula's family, it was a tragedy. And that difference matters. The unanswered question may be fascinating to us, but it was devastating to the people who loved her. Paula wasn't a plot twist. She wasn't a legend, she was someone's daughter, someone's friend, someone who had plans for her life. And perhaps that's why the best way to tell Paula's story isn't to pretend we've solved it. It's to show exactly where the evidence ends. To say what we know, to explain what investigators believed, to separate what remains possible from what cannot be proven. Because after all these decades, there is still one thing we cannot give Paula's story. But the story doesn't end with the disappearance. Because there is another mystery surrounding Paula. One that has survived almost as long as the case itself. What happened to the people who were closest to her? What did they remember? What did they believe? And what happened to the family after the years of searching produced nothing? Because sometimes, the aftermath of a disappearance tells us almost as much about the case as the disappearance itself. And there is one more question. A question that modern investigators might approach very differently from investigators in 1946. Could the landscape itself still contain the answer? The forests have changed, trails have changed, roads have changed, buildings have changed. But mountains move slowly, ravines remain. Certain places remain almost exactly where they were. And if Paula's remains were hidden somewhere in that landscape, perhaps they have been waiting all this time. Waiting for someone to look in exactly the right place. That possibility is what keeps cold cases alive. Not certainty, not proof. Hope. The hope that one day, someone will discover something that everyone else missed. A fragment, a document, a witness, a piece of evidence, anything. Because sometimes, and all it takes to reopen a 70-year-old mystery, is one new clue. And Paula's case has never had that final clue. At least, not one that has been publicly confirmed. So the search went cold, but the mystery didn't. It simply moved from police departments into history, and from history into folklore, and eventually into the internet. But there was one thing the internet could never provide. An answer. And that is where the next chapter begins. Because once the story entered the modern era, Paula's disappearance became something entirely different. People started searching the case again. New theories appeared, old evidence was re-examined. And one question began appearing again and again. Could Paula Welden still be found? Chapter 9. The case reopens in the digital age. For decades, Paula Welden's disappearance existed mostly in old newspaper clippings, police records, photographs, and the memories of people who had been alive when she vanished. Then the world changed. The internet arrived. And suddenly, a case that had been trapped in the past could be discussed by people who had never even been born in 1946. The photograph of the missing student could be shared instantly. Old newspaper reports could be discovered by researchers thousands of miles away. People could compare timelines, read old accounts, question old theories, and perhaps most importantly, they could ask the same question all over again. What happened to Paula Welden? But the internet brought something else with it, a problem. The more people talked about Paula, the more difficult it became to separate the original investigation from everything that had been added afterward. One website would repeat something from another website. A documentary would repeat a newspaper article. A later article would repeat the documentary. And eventually, a detail with no clear original source could begin looking like an established fact. That's how old mysteries evolve. Not necessarily through deliberate deception, sometimes just through repetition. The Bennington Triangle became a perfect example. The term sounds as though investigators had identified a specific geographic phenomenon. But there is no official law enforcement designation called the Bennington Triangle. It's a later label used to group several disappearances and strange stories associated with the region. That doesn't mean the disappearances weren't real. They were. It means the connection between them needs to be treated carefully, because 5 mysteries occurring in the same broad region don't automatically become one mystery. And that brings us back to Paula. The more famous the Bennington Triangle became, the more her disappearance was sometimes presented as if it were automatically part of something supernatural. But the original case didn't require anything supernatural. A young woman went hiking, she disappeared. There was a massive search. She was never found. That's already extraordinary. We don't need to add a mysterious force to make it interesting. Still, people continued searching for explanations. Some focused on the wilderness. Perhaps Paula became lost. Perhaps she suffered an accident. Perhaps her remains were hidden by the terrain. Perhaps winter conditions prevented searchers from finding her. These theories have one major advantage. They don't require another person to be involved. But they also have a major weakness. There is no confirmed physical evidence showing where Paula went. Then there are theories involving foul play. Maybe she encountered someone. Maybe she accepted a ride. Maybe she was taken against her will. Maybe the person responsible successfully removed every trace. This possibility cannot simply be dismissed, but neither can it be presented as fact. There is no confirmed killer, no confirmed crime scene, and no confirmed remains, so we're left with possibility, not proof. Then there is the theory that Paula voluntarily disappeared. The internet gave this theory new life. People began asking, what if she wanted to leave? What if she had been unhappy? What if she wanted a new identity? What if she simply walked away? These questions are reasonable. But a reasonable question isn't evidence, and there is no confirmed record establishing that Paula successfully began a new life somewhere else. No authenticated photograph, no verified later identity, no confirmed communication. Nothing that allows investigators to say, this is Paula after 1946. And that's one of the most frustrating things about the case. Every theory can explain part of the mystery, but none explains all of it. If she became lost, why wasn't she found? If she was murdered, where is the evidence? If she was abducted, who did it? If she left voluntarily, and where did she go? Every answer creates another question. Modern technology has made investigators much better at solving disappearances. But technology has one limitation. It can't recover information that never existed. In 1946, Paula didn't carry a smartphone. There was no GPS signal. There were no digital photographs recording her movements. There was no searchable database showing every vehicle she encountered. If she entered a car, there may be no surviving record. If she walked into the forest, there may be no record. If she crossed a particular road, there may be nobody who noticed. Reopening an old case isn't as simple as opening an old file. It's more like rebuilding a burned photograph. You may recover pieces, but you can't always recreate everything that was destroyed. And in Paula's case, time itself became part of the mystery. The witnesses who saw Paula that afternoon are no longer here. The people who searched for her in 1946 are gone. The investigators who worked on the original case are gone too. Even the landscape has changed. Someone who remembered a strange vehicle, an unusual conversation, or something they saw near the trail may have taken that memory to the grave. That's one reason old cases become harder with every passing decade. But sometimes time can work in the opposite direction. A family might clean out an old house and discover a forgotten letter. Someone might find a photograph in an attic. A diary could be opened for the first time in decades. Or a person who kept a secret for years might finally decide to speak. Sometimes unidentified remains can even be connected to an old case using modern DNA technology. Suddenly, something that seemed impossible can become possible. That's why cold cases are never completely dead while evidence still survives. And Paula's case has one important advantage. Her identity is well documented. We know who she was, what she looked like, where she studied, and the basic circumstances surrounding her disappearance. If new evidence were discovered, investigators would have information to compare it with. Photographs, family records, physical characteristics, and potentially DNA. Modern forensic technology is far more advanced than it was in 1946. If unidentified remains were ever conclusively connected to Paula, more than 70 years of uncertainty could finally come to an end. But there's an important difference between possible and likely. We shouldn't claim Paula will definitely be found. We shouldn't suggest investigators are close to solving the case unless there is evidence supporting that conclusion. The honest answer is much simpler. If credible new evidence appears, modern investigators have tools that the original search teams never had. That's all we can say. There's another reason Paula's disappearance remains fascinating. She vanished during an important period in American history. The United States was emerging from World War II. Colleges were changing. Women were entering a new post-war era. America was becoming more mobile. But communication was still extremely limited compared with today. There were no smartphones, no social media, no instant nationwide alerts, and no digital photographs that could reach millions of people within seconds. When Paula disappeared, communication depended on telephones, newspapers, radio, police reports, and ordinary people remembering what they had seen. A missing person could disappear from the information network very quickly. Imagine if Paula disappeared today. Her friends could contact her immediately. Her phone might reveal her last known location. Bank activity could show where she had been. Security cameras might capture her movements. Messages could reveal her plans. Search teams could use digital maps, and her photograph could be shared across the country almost instantly. None of those tools existed for Paula. Her final movements depended mainly on human beings, and human memory fades. That's why the original documents may be some of the most important evidence connected to the case. Police reports, witness statements, newspaper articles, letters, photographs, and anything else recorded close to the time Paula disappeared could still contain valuable information. Those records were created before decades of speculation changed the story. They may contain details that were later forgotten, ignored, exaggerated, or simply never repeated. And sometimes a forgotten detail can become the most important clue. But old records aren't automatically perfect. A newspaper can make a mistake. A witness can remember something incorrectly. A police report can contain assumptions. A later writer can misunderstand something written many years earlier. That's why researchers have to compare information carefully. When was the information recorded? Who recorded it? Was it first-hand information? Or was it simply repeated from another person? These questions are especially important in Paula's case, because the longer a mystery survives, the more people want to fill the silence. We want a villain. We want a motive. We want to find a location. We want an explanation that makes everything suddenly make sense. But sometimes there simply isn't enough evidence to provide one. And forcing an answer can actually make the story less truthful. Maybe Paula continued walking. Maybe she became lost. Maybe she suffered an accident. Maybe she encountered another person. Maybe she entered a vehicle. Maybe she turned around. Or maybe she went somewhere nobody expected. We don't know. And after more than 70 years, that uncertainty has become part of the case itself. But one thing is certain. Paula Welden wasn't a legend. She was a real person. She had a family. She had friends. She had plans for her future. And somewhere between the last confirmed sighting and the moment people realized she was missing, something happened. That moment is the missing piece. Everything else is an attempt to reconstruct what happened. The digital age didn't solve Paula's case, but it did something important. It kept her story from disappearing completely. Her name can still be searched. Her photograph can still be seen. Her disappearance can still be discussed. And her story can still reach people who were not even alive when she vanished. Perhaps one day someone who knows something will come across her story. Maybe they will recognize a name. Maybe a place, maybe an old photograph, maybe a family story that was never understood. And suddenly they might realize something. They might think, wait, I know something about this. That's how some cold cases begin moving again. Not always through a dramatic discovery. Sometimes it happens because one person remembers something and finally decides to speak. And there is one final possibility we have to consider. What if the answer isn't in the mountains at all? What if Paula's disappearance was connected to a person who left Vermont? What if the crucial evidence traveled with someone? What if the location everyone has been searching for was never the correct location? That possibility changes everything, because if Paula left the area in a vehicle, then the mountains may not be where the mystery ends. They may simply be where the trail disappears. And that brings us to the most important question of the entire investigation. What happened during the final confirmed hours of Paula Welden's life? Because if we can reconstruct those hours, we may finally understand what happened after she walked toward the long trail. Chapter 10, The Last Hours. Reconstructing Paula's final day. There is something haunting about the last ordinary day of a missing person. At the time, nobody knows it's the last. There's no warning, no final photograph, no final conversation where everyone suddenly understands its importance. Life simply continues until it doesn't. For Paula Welden, December 1st, 1946, began like another day at Bennington College. But by the end of it, she would disappear into one of Vermont's most enduring mysteries. Paula was 18 years old. She was a student at Bennington College, a young woman living away from home and beginning to build an adult life. She had interests, friends, plans, a future. Nothing about her final day necessarily looked like the beginning of a disappearance. And that's what makes reconstructing it so difficult. We're trying to understand a day that felt completely normal to the person living it, while knowing how it ended. At some point that day, Paula decided to go hiking. The destination was the Long Trail. The trail itself was not some mysterious place known only to a few people. It was a real hiking route through Vermont's Green Mountains. Paula had apparently expressed interest in seeing it. She was heading toward an area where she could hike and experience the outdoors. On the surface, there was nothing extraordinary about that. A college student goes for a walk. That's it until she doesn't come back. The first important question is, why did Paula choose that day? Was the decision spontaneous? Had she planned it earlier? Was she simply looking for something to do? Was she frustrated? Was she lonely? Was she trying to clear her head? We can't know for certain. And this is where documentaries often make a mistake. They take an unknown motivation and turn it into a dramatic explanation. But unless there is reliable evidence, we shouldn't do that. Paula may have had a completely ordinary reason. The next question is even more important. What did Paula take with her? Her clothing, her personal belongings, whatever she needed for a day outside. But there is no reliable evidence that she packed for a long journey, and that matters. If someone plans to disappear permanently, you might expect preparation, extra clothes, money, documents, some kind of plan. But if someone simply plans to go hiking for a few hours, you wouldn't. And Paula's disappearance appears to have begun as an ordinary outing. That makes the later events even harder to understand. At some point, Paula left the college. She began traveling toward the area of the Long Trail. The exact sequence of every stop is not perfectly documented. And that's where the timeline begins to become uncertain. We know she was seen, but eyewitness accounts don't give us a minute-by-minute reconstruction. Instead, they give us fragments. A sighting here, another detail there, a direction, a description, and investigators had to build a timeline from those pieces. Think about how difficult that is. Imagine asking someone, do you remember seeing this young woman on December 1st? Maybe they say yes. Then what time was it? They might say around 4. Then, which direction was she going? Maybe they remember. Maybe they don't. Now ask the same person years later. The answer may change. Not because they're lying, because memory changes. People remember events, but they don't always remember timestamps, and they rarely realize which tiny detail will become historically important. One of the most important details is that Paula was seen heading toward the Long Trail. That sighting creates a natural assumption. She must have continued toward the trail. But assumptions can be dangerous. Maybe she did, maybe she turned around. Maybe she stopped somewhere, maybe she met someone. Maybe she accepted transportation. Maybe she changed her mind. The last confirmed sighting doesn't necessarily show the final direction of her journey. It only shows where she was at that moment. This is where the case becomes a reconstruction rather than a recording. We don't have a camera following Paula. We don't have a map showing her movements. We have people remembering what they saw, and somewhere after the last reliable sighting, the trail goes cold. Imagine Paula continuing alone. The road stretches ahead, the mountains rise beyond it. The temperature is dropping, the daylight is fading. Maybe she is thinking about the trail. Maybe she is thinking about returning to campus before dark. Maybe she isn't worried at all. And then something happens, but what? That's the question that has survived for generations. If Paula became lost, the timing would have been terrible. Winter conditions can make mountain travel dangerous. Daylight disappears quickly, and a person who takes one wrong turn can lose the route they thought they understood. Once darkness arrives, everything changes. A familiar trail becomes difficult to recognize. A small stream becomes an obstacle. A steep slope becomes dangerous. Cold temperatures become a serious threat. Even a healthy person can become vulnerable surprisingly quickly. But there is a problem with this theory. If Paula died from exposure, why wasn't she found? The search was extensive. And while it is possible for remains to be missed in wilderness, the question still remains. Where could she have gone? How far could she have traveled? Did she leave the trail? Did she fall? Did she search for shelter? Did she cross a road? We don't know. And without remains, those questions cannot be answered. Now consider another major possibility. Paula may have encountered another person. Maybe someone offered her a ride. Maybe she accepted. Maybe she knew the person. Maybe she didn't. Maybe nothing about the encounter appeared dangerous at first. This possibility is frightening because it requires only a brief encounter. A few seconds, a short conversation, one decision, and suddenly, the entire direction of someone's life could change. But if someone took Paula, where did they take her? That's the problem. There is no confirmed vehicle connected to her disappearance. There is no confirmed crime scene. There is no confirmed witness who saw Paula being forced into a vehicle. There is no confession. There are no confirmed remains. Because of that, we cannot say an abduction definitely occurred. It remains a possibility, nothing more. Then there is another theory. Perhaps Paula disappeared voluntarily. Maybe she wanted to leave her old life behind. Maybe she had personal reasons that nobody understood. Maybe she was unhappy. Maybe she wanted a different life. But again, there is no strong confirmed evidence showing that Paula deliberately planned to disappear, and that's an important distinction. A missing person is not automatically a runaway, and an 18-year-old choosing to go hiking is not automatically evidence of an escape plan. So we arrive at the central problem. Every theory requires us to imagine something that was never documented. The accident theory requires us to imagine where Paula went. The murder theory requires us to imagine who she encountered. The abduction theory requires us to imagine how she was transported. The voluntary disappearance theory requires us to imagine a plan that nobody discovered. And because none of these possibilities can be confirmed, the mystery survives. There is another detail worth considering. Paula's disappearance happened during a time when traveling alone was not unusual. Hitchhiking was common. People relied on strangers for transportation more than many people do today. There were fewer alternatives. There were no ride-sharing applications, no instant transportation requests, no smartphones. If someone was trying to reach a trailhead, accepting a ride may not have seemed unusual at all. And that creates another possibility. What if Paula simply got into a car? If the driver was innocent, perhaps the ride ended somewhere and Paula continued on her own. If the driver was responsible, then the last confirmed sighting could be misleading. The trail may never have been her final destination. That's why the final confirmed sighting is so important but also so dangerous. It can create an illusion of certainty. People may think, she was heading toward the trail, so the answer must be somewhere on that trail. But we don't actually know that. The trail may have been the last place Paula was seen, not the last place she went. Imagine Paula continuing alone. The road stretches ahead. The mountains rise beyond it. The temperature is dropping. The daylight is fading. Maybe she is thinking about the trail. Maybe she is thinking about returning to campus before dark. Maybe she isn't worried at all. And then something happens, but what? That's the question that has survived for generations. And this may explain why the search never produced the answer. What if investigators were looking for Paula in the wrong place? What if she had already left the area? What if she was taken somewhere else? What if she had entered a vehicle and traveled miles away? Then every hour spent searching the mountain would move investigators farther from the truth. But there is another possibility. Maybe the search area was correct and the evidence simply vanished. That can happen in wilderness cases. Snow covers tracks, rain washes away footprints, animals disturb remains, vegetation changes, streams move objects, time breaks down materials, and human beings eventually stop searching. A clue that might have solved the case in 1946 could have become impossible to recognize decades later. This is the part of Paula's story that is almost impossible for modern people to understand. We live in a world where movement creates records. We leave digital footprints everywhere. We send messages, use cards, carry phones, appear on cameras. Connect to networks Paula didn't. Her physical existence could disappear without creating a digital trace. And once she disappeared, there was almost nothing modern investigators could follow. Imagine the investigators' situation. They have a photograph, a description, a last known direction, a mountain and thousands of acres of terrain. That's it, no phone, no GPS, no digital communication, no database showing where she had been, no electronic evidence, just a missing woman and a huge landscape. The case became increasingly difficult as time passed. Every new day without Paula reduced the chance of finding her alive. Every new week made physical evidence less reliable. Every new month increased the number of possible explanations. And eventually, the search became a cold case. But cold doesn't mean forgotten. It means the investigation no longer has enough active leads to keep moving at the same intensity. And Paula's disappearance has one feature that keeps bringing people back. There is no confirmed ending. We know how the story begins. We know where Paula was. We know she disappeared. But we don't know what happened afterward. It's like watching a film where the final 20 minutes have been removed. You can understand the characters. You can follow the story. You can see the setup. But then, the screen goes black. And perhaps that is why people have spent decades trying to fill in the missing scene. Some believe it was an accident. Some believe it was murder. Some believe it was an abduction. Some believe Paula chose to leave. Others believe the answer is connected to the mysterious reputation of the Bennington region. But none of those theories has produced definitive proof. So let's return to the last moment we can reasonably describe. Paula is walking. She's 18. She's alone. The mountains are ahead. The road is behind her, somewhere nearby. People are going about their ordinary lives. Cars pass, people work. The afternoon continues. Nobody knows that a mystery is beginning. Nobody knows her name will still be remembered more than 70 years later. Nobody knows that investigators will search for her. Nobody knows that her disappearance will become part of Vermont folklore, and nobody knows that this may be the last time anyone ever sees Paula Welden. Then, she disappears. Not from the world. From the evidence, that's the distinction. We know she existed, we know she was there, but after a certain point, we don't know where she went. And that gap is where the entire mystery lives. Perhaps someday that gap will close, a forgotten document, a newly identified set of remains, a family confession, a credible witness, a forensic discovery, or perhaps nothing will ever be found. And Paula's final journey will remain one of America's oldest unsolved disappearances. But there is one final part of the story we need to examine. The question of what happened after Paula disappeared and why. Despite decades of theories, the case still refuses to die. Because sometimes, the most revealing part of an unsolved mystery isn't the answer. It's what people do when they don't have one. Chapter 11. Theories, suspects, and the search for someone to blame. Once a person disappears without explanation, something almost inevitable happens. People start looking for someone to blame. It is easier to accept that a person was harmed by someone than to accept that she simply vanished into uncertainty. A suspect gives the story a shape. A motive gives it meaning. A crime gives it an ending. But Paula Welden's case never provided that ending. Instead, it produced theories, some reasonable, some speculative, and some that became more dramatic with every retelling. The challenge is separating what investigators actually knew from what people later believed. One of the most frequently discussed names is Fred Gaudette. He lived in the general area where Paula disappeared and became a person of interest during the investigation. That alone made him important to investigators. But being a person of interest doesn't mean being guilty. Police investigate people because they may have information. They may have been near the disappearance. They may have provided inconsistent statements. Or investigators may simply need to eliminate them from consideration. A person can look suspicious and still be completely innocent. Gaudette's name remained attached to the story because of questions surrounding his statements and movements. Investigators wanted to understand what he had been doing around the time Paula disappeared. They wanted his timeline to make sense. They wanted to know whether he had encountered her. And if he hadn't, they wanted to know why parts of his account appeared problematic. These are reasonable investigative questions, but they don't automatically establish a crime. That's where cold case storytelling can become dangerous. A person is questioned. The public hears that police were suspicious. Years later, someone tells the story again. The phrase changes. Police questioned him. Becomes police suspected him. Then, he was a suspect. Then eventually, he probably killed her. Each step sounds small, but by the end, the meaning has completely changed. And suddenly a person who was never convicted becomes a murderer in the public imagination. That's not evidence, that's storytelling. So what do we actually know? We know investigators looked closely at people in the area. We know Gaudette became associated with the case. We know questions were raised about his statements. But there was no definitive evidence establishing that he killed Paula. There was no confirmed body, no confirmed murder weapon, no verified crime scene, no confession that solved the case, and no court determination that Gaudette was responsible. That means the responsible position is simple. He remains part of the investigation's history, not a proven killer. But if Gaudette wasn't responsible, who was? That question has driven the case for decades. Maybe another local man, maybe a stranger, maybe someone Paula encountered while traveling, maybe someone who knew her, or maybe nobody. Perhaps there was no homicide at all. And that's where the accident theory returns. Imagine Paula reaching the trail. The weather changes. She becomes disoriented. The daylight disappears. She takes a wrong turn, she falls. Maybe she suffers an injury she can't return. Searchers eventually arrive, but they're looking somewhere else. It is a horrifying scenario, but it doesn't require a killer. And sometimes the most frightening explanation is also the simplest. Nature doesn't need a motive. The wilderness doesn't leave fingerprints. It doesn't give interviews, it doesn't confess, and it doesn't tell investigators where someone fell. If Paula died from exposure or an accident, the mountain could have kept the secret for decades, but then comes another problem. If she died in the wilderness, why wasn't she found? The search was large. People knew where she had been headed. The FBI became involved. The case attracted public attention. And yet, no confirmed remains were discovered. That doesn't disprove an accident, but it makes the question harder. How far could Paula have traveled? Where could she have gone? What terrain would have hidden her? And could modern technology eventually locate what earlier searches missed? Then there is the possibility of abduction. Perhaps Paula encountered a stranger. Maybe someone offered her transportation. Maybe she accepted. Maybe the interaction seemed harmless. And then, something went wrong. If that happened, investigators would have faced a nightmare. They wouldn't necessarily know the person's name. They wouldn't necessarily know the vehicle. They wouldn't know where Paula had been taken. And there may have been no physical evidence. A person could disappear, and the person responsible could simply drive away. But again, there is no confirmed evidence proving that happened. No eyewitness account conclusively showing an abduction. No known suspect established by forensic evidence. No body, no confession. No definitive crime scene. So the abduction theory remains possible, but unproven. Another theory is even more difficult to evaluate. What if Paula met someone she already knew? Someone from college, someone from the area. Someone who could convince her to leave willingly. This possibility changes the nature of the investigation. Because if Paula willingly entered a vehicle, a witness might never have recognized the situation as suspicious. They might have seen two people talking. Nothing unusual, nothing worth remembering. And by the time anyone realized Paula was missing, the opportunity to reconstruct the encounter could already have disappeared. This is one of the reasons investigators care so much about seemingly ordinary witnesses. A person who says, "I saw Paula talking to a man," may not realize how important that information is. The witness might not know the man's name. They might not remember what he was wearing. They might not remember the vehicle. But one small detail could potentially connect multiple pieces of evidence. That's how investigations sometimes move forward, not through dramatic discoveries, but through ordinary observations. Then there's the voluntary disappearance theory. It has survived because Paula was 18. She was an adult, she was away from home. She was living in a college environment. And people sometimes reach a point where they want to escape their old lives. Maybe she wanted independence, maybe she was unhappy, maybe she wanted to start over. Maybe she had personal problems nobody else understood. All of those things are possible, but possibility isn't evidence. And there is a second problem. If Paula intentionally disappeared, why has there been no confirmed trace of her afterward? Someone living a normal life leaves traces. Employment, housing, relationships, medical records, travel.
Correspondence.friends.
Even people trying to disappear usually leave some kind of footprint. But because Paula's case predates modern record keeping, that footprint may be impossible to reconstruct. So again, we cannot prove she died, but we also cannot prove she survived. This is where the case becomes emotionally brutal. Her family couldn't know which possibility to believe. If they believed she was dead, they had no body. If they believed she was alive, they had no evidence. Imagine waking up every morning with both possibilities existing at the same time. Your daughter might be gone forever, or she might be somewhere in the world. How do you grieve someone when you don't know whether they are dead? How do you stop hoping? And that question isn't unique to Paula. Families of missing people often experience something called ambiguous loss. The person is absent, but there is no definitive ending. Life continues around the family. Birthdays happen, holidays happen, years pass. But emotionally, a part of the family remains stuck on the day the person disappeared. For Paula's family, that day was December 1st, 1946. Meanwhile, the public moved on. New stories appeared, new crimes happened, new generations grew up, but every few years and someone rediscovered Paula's disappearance. And the theories came back. The mountains, the trail, Godet. The Bennington Triangle. The possibility of murder, the possibility of survival. The mystery became almost immortal. And then something fascinating happened. The mystery began attracting theories that had little to do with the original evidence. Some people suggested paranormal explanations. Others discussed UFOs. Others imagined secret groups. Some theories became increasingly elaborate. But the more elaborate a theory becomes, the more evidence it needs. A supernatural explanation would require extraordinary evidence, and there isn't reliable evidence establishing one. So we should leave those ideas where they belong, in the realm of speculation. The truth may be far less dramatic. Maybe Paula got lost. Maybe she died from exposure. Maybe she suffered an accident. Maybe she encountered someone dangerous. Maybe she deliberately disappeared. The fact that we don't know which one is true doesn't mean every theory has equal probability. It simply means the evidence isn't sufficient to establish a definitive answer. And that's an important distinction. An unsolved case doesn't mean anything could have happened. It means several possibilities remain, but the available evidence doesn't allow us to confidently select one. That's a much more honest way to look at a mystery. There is another reason people focus on suspects. A suspect makes the story personal. Instead of saying, Paula disappeared, we can say someone did this. The second statement feels more satisfying. It creates an enemy. But sometimes there is no enemy we can identify. Sometimes the mystery isn't about finding a villain. It's about understanding how a person could disappear without leaving enough evidence behind. And that may be the real tragedy of Paula's case. Not just that she disappeared, but that the disappearance happened in a time when technology was too limited to preserve the evidence we would rely on today. If Paula disappeared in the modern era, there might be hundreds of digital clues. In 1946, there may have been only a few human memories, and memories fade. So after more than 70 years, we are left with a handful of serious possibilities. Accident, foul play, abduction, voluntary disappearance, and the possibility that the truth is something completely different. None has been conclusively proven, and no individual can responsibly be declared Paula's killer without evidence. But there is one thing that still bothers investigators and researchers: the lack of a final physical clue. In most famous mysteries, there is something. A body, a weapon, a photograph, a letter, a piece of clothing, something. Paula's case has almost none of that. And that raises one final question. What if the most important clue was never recognized as a clue at all? What if someone saw something in 1946, but didn't understand what they were seeing? What if a witness remembered a vehicle but never reported it? What if an object was found, but nobody connected it to Paula? What if an old document contains a detail that has been overlooked for decades? That possibility is why old cases continue to be re-examined, because sometimes the answer isn't hidden, it's simply buried under everything else. And if Paula's case still contains one surviving clue, it may not be dramatic. It may be a sentence. A name, a date, a location, something ordinary, something everyone ignored, until someone finally asks the right question. And that brings us to the final stage of our investigation. Not the legends, not the rumors, not the supernatural theories, but the question that matters most. If Paula Welden were found today, could modern science finally tell us what happened to her? Chapter 12. Could modern science finally solve Paula Welden's disappearance? For decades, Paula Welden's disappearance depended almost entirely on human memory. Someone remembered seeing her. Someone remembered where she was going. Someone remembered what she was wearing. Someone remembered a conversation. And investigators tried to connect those memories into a timeline. But memory has a weakness, it disappears too. Today, investigators have something that people searching for Paula in 1946 never had: modern forensic science. And that raises an intriguing question. If evidence connected to Paula were discovered today, could science finally tell us what happened? The evidence that never existed before, talking about DNA, databases, or modern technology, we need to understand the biggest problem. Modern science can only analyze evidence that still exists. It cannot analyze a footprint that disappeared beneath snow in 1946. It cannot examine a conversation that nobody wrote down. It cannot recover a vehicle that was never identified. And it cannot reconstruct every step Paula took after the final confirmed sighting. Science is incredibly powerful, but it isn't magic. If the physical evidence is gone, the technology can't bring it back. What if remains were found? This is probably the most important possibility. Imagine that hikers discover human remains somewhere in Vermont. The remains are badly decomposed. Perhaps they've been exposed to the elements for decades. At first, there may be almost nothing recognizable. No identification, no documents, no obvious connection to Paula, just bones. In 1946, investigators would have faced an enormous problem. Today, the situation could be completely different. Forensic anthropologists could examine the remains. They could estimate biological characteristics. Investigators could document the location. They could compare dental evidence if available, and potentially where DNA could provide the answer. Could the mountains still hold evidence? Possibly. The Green Mountains are enormous. Even heavily searched wilderness contains places that people don't visit regularly. Terrain changes, trees fall, paths shift, new trails appear, old paths disappear. Something hidden in 1946 might not be visible today. And something discovered today might not have been visible to searchers then. That's why wilderness cold cases can remain open for extraordinary periods of time. But there's another problem. The more time passes, the more the environment changes. Rain, snow, animals, vegetation, erosion, human activity. All of these can move or destroy evidence. A location that once contained a clue may now look completely different. And then there is the human factor. Even the best forensic investigation still depends on people. Someone has to find the evidence. Someone has to report it. Someone has to recognize its importance. Someone has to investigate it. And someone has to be willing to ask difficult questions. That's why public awareness matters. A person who has heard Paula's story might one day recognize something. Perhaps an old family story. Perhaps a photograph, perhaps a name. Perhaps a document. Maybe they've had the information for years without realizing what it meant. This happens in cold cases. Sometimes the breakthrough isn't technology, it's memory. Someone finally says, "I remember something." And suddenly, the investigation has somewhere to go. But would anyone still be alive? This is perhaps the hardest question. Paula disappeared in 1946. More than 7 decades have passed. Anyone who was an adult witness at the time would now be extremely old or deceased. Many potential witnesses are simply no longer here. That means investigators increasingly depend on secondhand information. A son remembers something his father told him. A daughter remembers something her mother said. A family remembers an unusual story. But secondhand information must be treated carefully. Memories change as stories are retold. Details become mixed together. Sometimes people unintentionally add information they learned later. And yet, even a secondhand story can lead investigators to something testable. That's the key. A story by itself isn't proof, but a story can point toward evidence. The question of closure. If Paula were identified today, what would that mean for her family? For people who have spent generations wondering? For historians, for investigators? For everyone who has followed the mystery? It would finally separate 2 questions that have been connected for decades. Where is Paula? And what happened to Paula? The first could potentially be answered. The second might still remain. But even that would be enormous progress. Because an unidentified missing person creates a special kind of uncertainty. You don't know whether you're searching for a living person. You don't know whether you're searching for remains. You don't know where to look. You don't know what happened. Finding her would remove at least one of those unknowns. And perhaps that's why Paula's story still matters. Not because we know the answer, but because we don't. The case reminds us how quickly an ordinary day can become history. How vulnerable people were before modern technology. How difficult wilderness investigations can be. And how much a family can lose when a loved one disappears without explanation. More than 70 years later, Paula's name is still remembered. Her photograph still exists, her story still raises questions, and the mountains still stand where they did when she disappeared. The world around them has changed. But one question has remained almost exactly the same. Where did Paula Welden go? And perhaps, somewhere in an old box, an archive, a forgotten photograph, or a remote corner of Vermont? The answer is still waiting. Chapter 13. Paula Welden, the person behind the mystery. For more than 70 years, people have remembered the disappearance of Paula Welden. Her story has become connected with the Vermont mountains, the long trail, the search that followed, and the many theories about what may have happened to her. But behind all of those theories was a real person. Her name was Paula Jean Welden. She was 18 years old, a college student and a young woman who was just beginning her adult life. Paula was studying at Bennington College in Vermont. Like many students her age, she was building friendships, learning about herself and thinking about her future. She had many possibilities ahead of her. She could have completed college, started a career, traveled, married, raised a family, or moved to another part of the country. Her future could have taken many different directions. Instead, her life became known because of what happened on December 1st, 1946. Before that day, Paula's life was filled with ordinary experiences. There were photographs of her, college records, family memories, friends, and people who knew her personally. After that day, the information becomes much more uncertain. Her disappearance created a gap in the story of her life, and investigators had to work with whatever information they could find. Today, when people hear the name Paula Welden, they often think about a missing college student connected with a famous mystery. But Paula was much more than a missing person case. She was a daughter, a student, a friend, and an 18-year-old woman who had plans for the future. Paula enjoyed hiking, and on the afternoon of December 1st, she headed toward the Vermont mountains. At the time, there was nothing to suggest that this ordinary journey would become the most important event associated with her name. She could not have known that newspapers would report her disappearance, investigators would search for her, and people would continue discussing her case many decades later. When people study an old disappearance, it can be easy to think of the missing person only as part of the mystery. In reality, people who disappear are simply living their lives. They make plans, talk with friends, travel, walk, and make decisions without knowing that those ordinary actions may later become important evidence. Paula was doing the same thing. She was living an ordinary day. At some point, something changed. But the available evidence does not provide a complete explanation of what happened after her last confirmed sightings. That uncertainty was one of the biggest challenges for investigators. Paula disappeared in 1946, at a time when technology was very different from what exists today. There were no smartphones, internet services, GPS devices, social media platforms, or widespread security cameras. A person's movements were usually recorded only when another person happened to see them. If Paula walked along a road, there was no device automatically recording her location. If she changed her plans, there might be no record of the change. If another person saw her, investigators had to depend on that person's memory and description. This does not mean that investigators ignored the case. Search teams worked in the area. Authorities questioned people, followed leads, and eventually involved federal investigators. A major effort was made to locate Paula, but no confirmed final location was established. There was another difficulty. Paula was 18 years old and was legally an adult. She could make her own decisions about where she went and what she wanted to do. A change in her plans might not immediately appear unusual to the people around her. This is one reason the early period after a disappearance is so important. Investigators need to determine when the person was last seen, where they were going, who they were with, what they were carrying, and what plans they may have had. However, people do not always realize immediately that someone has disappeared. Friends may believe that a person has changed their plans. Family members may expect them to return later. Someone may assume that the person is staying with another friend. By the time everyone understands that something is seriously wrong, important information may already be difficult to recover. In Paula's case, the search eventually covered a large area. Searchers examined the surrounding wilderness. Authorities followed different leads, and the FBI became involved. Yet investigators never found a confirmed final location for Paula. This left a major gap in the case. There were roads, trails, mountains, and possible routes, but there was no clear evidence showing exactly where Paula went after she was last seen. Paula also could not provide her own explanation. She could not confirm which witness remembered events correctly. She could not explain what she was doing or where she intended to go. She could not tell investigators whether she had met another person or changed her plans. Because of this, later researchers have had to examine the available evidence carefully and separate documented information from theories. Over the years, Paula's disappearance became connected with the story of the Bennington Triangle. The region became associated with several unexplained disappearances, and that reputation brought additional attention to Paula's case. However, the legend developed around the case later. Paula herself was a real person before the legend existed. Her disappearance was a real event involving a real young woman, and that fact should remain at the center of the story. For Paula's family, the case was never simply an interesting mystery. It was the disappearance of someone they loved. Theories and newspaper stories could not replace the person who was missing. The central issue remained the same. They wanted to know what happened to Paula. Years passed and then decades passed. People who had known Paula personally grew older. Some eventually died. New generations learned about her through photographs, documents, family stories, newspaper reports, and later research. That is how an unanswered disappearance can become part of family history. People who never met the missing person can still learn their name. Old photographs can survive. Letters and documents can survive. Memories can be passed from parents to children and then to grandchildren. The absence of one person can continue affecting a family long after the original disappearance. This is an important part of understanding cold cases. Behind every missing person investigation, there are people who continue living with the unanswered questions. There may be an empty place in a family, important dates that remain difficult, and memories of someone who never returned home. Paula disappeared during a period when information traveled much more slowly than it does today. Newspapers were important sources of information. Radio reports could reach local communities. Police bulletins and word of mouth helped spread descriptions of missing people. There were no online platforms where millions of people could receive information within minutes. There were no social media campaigns that could immediately distribute a photograph across the country. Today, Paula's photograph can be found and shared much more easily. Her name can be searched from almost anywhere. Researchers can study old records. Historians can examine newspaper archives, and documentaries can introduce her story to people who were born many decades after her disappearance. This has helped keep her case from being forgotten. But there is also a danger when an old disappearance becomes famous. The mystery can eventually become more recognizable than the person who disappeared. Rumors can be repeated as theories. Theories can become popular stories, and the original facts can become harder to separate from later speculation. That is why Paula should first be remembered as a person. She was 18 years old. She was a college student. She was a daughter and a friend. She was a young woman who went toward the Vermont mountains on an ordinary December day. She had a future that had not yet been written. She had opportunities ahead of her and experiences she had not yet lived. Her disappearance prevented anyone from knowing what that future might have become. The case may still produce new information someday. An old document could be discovered. A previously unknown photograph could appear. A family memory could provide a useful detail. Modern forensic methods could potentially help identify evidence connected to the disappearance. There is no guarantee that any of these things will happen, but the possibility remains as long as relevant evidence can still be found and examined. The absence of an answer does not erase Paula's life. She existed before she became the subject of a famous disappearance. People knew her, cared about her, and remembered her. More than 70 years later, the exact circumstances of her disappearance remain unresolved. Her final destination has never been conclusively established, and the available evidence does not provide a complete explanation of what happened after she was last seen. But the historical record still tells us something important about her. Paula Welden was an 18-year-old college student with a future ahead of her. On December 1st, 1946, she disappeared in Vermont. Her case became a mystery, but she was a real person before she became a mystery. Her name has survived through photographs, records, family memories, investigations, books, documentaries, and public interest. The final answer has never been found, but Paula Welden has not been forgotten. Her story remains one of the enduring missing person cases in American history, and the question surrounding her disappearance remains unanswered.